Hey people, Shinobi no Kami here. In this fanfic, due to a tragic event, Naruto awakens the Rinnegan and becomes a monk. How will this affect the timeline? Will it lead him on a path towards peace, or will the consequences of this new power leave a hole in his heart too large to fill? Before we begin, please like, share, and subscribe if you enjoy it. Tell me your thoughts in the comments section. So without any further ado, let's roll the intro. Chapter 77, Embers Part 1. Bury the pain of losing your loved ones into the arms of your friends. Urza Scarlet. Naruto stared out over the glittering waters that marked the natural boundary of Uzu no Kuni. Over in the distance he could just about spot the violent edge of one of the island's many whirlpools. He thought about it as he watched the waters swirl, the endless currents pulling and tugging in a myriad of directions, yet ultimately leading up to the same converging point at the center. It was very representative of life. It could take any number of paths or turns, and you could struggle until your last breath, but the end result would always be the same. It would only take the most remarkable, or valiant, or even luckiest of beings to escape the swirling vortex out into the calmer, peaceful waters surrounding it. The blonde chuckled lightly, wondering when he had become so pensive that he had almost begun to contemplate the cycle of samsara itself. He supposed it was only appropriate given what his eyes represented and were named for, paths included. He sighed as he turned, feeling a hand rest lightly on his shoulder as he smiled at Fu, the two of them turning to face Tayuya, Haku, and Hinoka. You know, I really hadn't expected this. Despite the slightly saddened tone to the blonde's voice, he had a small, happy smile on his face regardless. I always knew our paths would have to diverge at some point, just not so soon. The news that Tayuya wanted to stay in Uzushio with Hinoka to help rebuild their family had come as a great shock to both Naruto and Fu. Then the fact that Haku would be staying with her, to see where their newfound relationship would take them, while less shocking, was no less upsetting for the pair. Hey, it's hard for us too, you know. Despite her best attempts at acting unperturbed by the whole situation, there was the smallest of cracks in the normally volatile redhead's voice. Haku simply nodded, his eyes still projecting that same saddened, melancholic expression he had worn since deciding to stay. Choosing between his friends and Tayuya wasn't as hard as he might have expected, but it was still a choice he would rather not have made. He had been genuinely happy traveling with the peaceful but optimistic blonde and stoic but warm Verdette the past 3 years. While he was sure he would continue to be happy with Tayuya, it was still a difficult thing to say goodbye, at least for now. The ice user paused for a moment, his brow furrowing as he stepped forward, pulling first Fu, then Naruto into long hugs. I owe you more than I could begin to repay, not only for saving my life, and for saving Tayuya's, but for saving me from myself. You showed me that I really could live for myself, that my worth was greater than that of a tool, even though I do not regret my time with Zabuza for a second. He sighed, taking in one last look at the pair as the words struggled to reach his tongue. Like I said, I can't even begin to repay that debt, but I still want to thank you, for everything. Naruto simply smiled at the boy, and even the edges of Fu's mouth quirked up a bit at the heartfelt words, showing more than enough for those that knew her. You shouldn't worry, you've more than made up for it simply being a friend to us. Haku smiled lightly, even if he didn't look entirely convinced. To reaffirm his statement, Naruto quickly returned the friendly hug. He didn't make it too long though, for him it wasn't to say goodbye after all, he would be seeing his friends again. After that Haku seemed to quieten, unsure of what to say anymore, or even if anything more needed to be said. In the brief moment of pause, Naruto turned to Tayuya, failing to keep the mildly expectant gaze from his features. The redhead simply looked back at him, her usual harmless scowl slowly creeping over her features. What? You expect some kind of pansy-ass goodbye or something? She huffed, having to look away for a moment to mask the slight catch in her voice. It was a small but noticeable voice in her head that whispered that in this world any goodbye could be one's last, a remnant of a harsh childhood full of disappointments and unfairness. Naruto just smiled at the girl, not having expected much else from the confident, independent young woman he had truly come to enjoy knowing over the last few years. He too knew the harsh realities of the world, but it was his quiet, hopeful optimism that kept him from shying away from open displays of companionship, without which he was sure he would have gone insane long ago. You don't need to say anything to Yuya, you can say anything you like next time we talk. It was short, abrupt and rather anticlimactic, just the way he expected a goodbye with the newfound Uzumaki girl. Therefore it came as a shock when he turned to walk away, feeling content with the farewells already said, when a slightly smaller hand grasped his own. Before he really knew what was happening, he was spun around and practically thrown into a rough, mildly awkward and unpracticed hug. For a moment his rippled eyes widened in shock and confusion, staring down the flowing red mane of his longtime friend's hair as he felt her arms squeeze him a little too strongly for a friendly hug. After only a tiny moment's hesitation, he wrapped his own arms around her in turn, feeling her body tense around the unfamiliar contact. It was over in a few seconds, the two pulling away from one another as Yuya looked down awkwardly, not having thought much beyond the rather impulsive hug that had even taken her by surprise. However, for once that stubborn part of the redhead did not speak up, telling her to make some sarcastic remark. "Thank you, Naruto." Her voice was small and a little unsure, but she quickly covered it up as she managed to just about lift her head to meet the taller boy's eye, some more confidence entering her tone. "I mean it. For saving me, for freeing me, for giving me another chance, for allowing me a life I would have never dreamed of before, for opening up something." Her eyes flickered over to Haku in a split second, a brief movement that Naruto just about caught, "something I couldn't have even imagined happening for me." She took a deep breath, seemingly collecting her thoughts after basically splurging whatever was on her mind. She wasn't used to being so open with her words like this, and to her emotions were things to be kept hidden, precious and personal. "It's all because of you, and like Haku, I owe you more of a debt than I could ever hope to repay in this lifetime." She chuckled with genuine mirth, her posture finally relaxing into something more recognizable of the normal redhead everyone had come to know. "But at the same time, I know you would never hold me to anything, even if I might never quite understand why." Naruto just nodded, a large, warm smile spreading over his features as he practically felt the glow of Yuya's released emotion flowing through her words. After a few moments of silence though, Naruto realized everybody was looking at him, expecting him to say something even though he wasn't entirely sure of just what to say to something so utterly heartfelt from the most unexpected source. I'm not quite sure what to say. Like I said, I didn't expect this so soon." The blonde looked down, once again feeling that rush of sadness at the thought of parting from such good friends, people he had lived with for the past 3 years. However, when he looked back up, his features were firm in their warm, soft smile. "I never really knew what it was like to have friends or family before the temple took me in. Even there I received only a glimpse of a normal life I might have had." All of his friends looked down at that, each thinking of their rough past and their rocky starts in life. However, they each looked up as Naruto directed his gaze to them, first to Hinoka, then Fu, then Haku and finally to Yuya. "Being with all of you is the closest thing to family I will ever have in this life, that I can guarantee you, so in a way, I owe each of you my own debt." To Yuya and Haku's eyes widened at that, and even Fu seemed a little surprised, each never having though Naruto felt that way, or at least so strongly. "However, I know I'm going to repay that debt someday, because this isn't the last time we'll meet." His smile grew a little, raising the general air of the small beach they were standing on. "So how about no more goodbyes, alright?" Without any warning, the Rinnegan bearer touched his hand to the ground, and in an enormous plume of smoke a great, drill-beaked bird stood before them, observing the group curiously with its own ringed gray eyes. In a flash, Naruto and Fu were atop it, precariously holding onto the black rod protruding from its back. "Take good care of Uzushio while I'm gone." He smirked fondly as he looked across as much of the island as he could one last time. "I'll hold you to your promise, Hinoka." He had to shout the words as the enormous bird began flapping its wings in great, sweeping motions that had the 3 teens on the beach holding their clothes as they flapped in the sudden wind. "Wow, he really knows how to make an exit, doesn't he?" Hinoka finally broke the silence that had settled on the beach, much to the mildly amused chuckle from Haku and Yuya. Are you really sure about staying? It must be amazing to travel with somebody like that. Both Haku and Tayuya sighed fondly, both looked out to where the small dot on the horizon finally shrank out of sight. Yeah, it was. The two had left Uzu no Kuni late in the morning, so the sun had already long passed its zenith in the sky by the time land could be seen below them. The great bird they rode on made lazy arcs through the air before coming to a surprisingly gentle landing in a thankfully barren field somewhere near the coast of the large island nation they had arrived at. Fu dropped off the summons first, thankful to be away from the strange drill-beaked creature. She was no stranger to flight, but this particular bird always sent a chill down her spine when it looked at her with its Rinnegan eyes. It simply unnerved her, as they were a slightly different color to Naruto's own, a deeper metallic gray compared to his more vibrant violet. Ah, it's been a long time since we were here. The blonde dropped off the bird next, patting his massive summon when he landed, despite the bird not even seeming to notice the contact, or even his presence beyond a quick glance. It was almost as if the bird was trying to ignore them, anxious to get away for some reason, which was odd considering it should have simply been a construct of chakra created when Naruto needed a summon, no more free thinking than a shadow clone. It doesn't seem to have changed all that much. Naruto simply shrugged to his friend, looking around at the small, neat little forest they had landed in. They had caught glimpses of Nami no Kuni from the air, and Fu was right, not a lot seemed to have changed, at least structurally. However, they were almost unprepared for the difference in the village as they finally emerged from the forestry and onto the outskirts of the town they had stayed in those 3 years ago. Wow! The streets were bustling with life where before they were stark and empty, people too. Afraid to walk outside for extended periods in fear of being spotted by Getu's thugs. In the same vein, the general sense of oppression that had existed amongst the populace was practically non-existent. If Naruto hadn't been there to see the poverty and strife of the downtrodden people first time, he would have never imagined this little thriving community had ever been anything other than what it was now. It was simply and probably couldn't sum up the complete feeling of the nation, but the only way Naruto could really describe the change was happiness. I don't believe how much has changed. Fu just nodded, glancing around as various people flowed around them, chatting, shouting cheery greetings, and just generally going about their business. It seemed like a fairly mundane, normal street to most, but to the two that had seen all of this before and none of the in-between, it was like standing in a dream. Finally, a grin split Naruto's face as he began moving through the crowds, effortlessly slipping between jostling people as Fu followed behind him with ease. It took another few minutes, but finally they reached a familiar house in a peaceful forest glade that they remembered. Except not quite, as the wood was cleaned up and repainted, and the neat little flower garden that used to exist just outside of the homely porch had blossomed into a full bouquet of brightly colored flowers. A young dark-haired woman sat outside, a soft smile on her face as she worked through patching up what appeared to be a pair of brown worker's pants. Tsunami. The woman looked up quickly, a look of intrigue on her face as she regarded the two teens approaching her. The slight confusion in her eyes quickly vanished as she noticed the bright spiky yellow hair and familiar shakuju traveling alongside an equally unique set of mint green bangs. Naruto. Fu. The three had gone inside and were sitting around the dinner table, which Naruto couldn't help but notice was new, a large improvement over the old, weathered one he remembered sitting around as a younger monk. He gently sipped from the tea Tsunami had graciously offered and had to nod his head in appreciation. It was just as good as he remembered it. Tsunami just removed her apron, hanging it up on a nearby wall before joining them, that same perpetually soft smile still alighting her features. It is really good to see you two again, safe and well. Naruto nodded again, this time in appreciation of her concern. Did you two happen to get a look around the village before stopping by? Another nod, and Tsunami's smile only seemed to grow as she settled back, a content sigh escaping her lips. It's wonderful, isn't it? How much is different from back then. I even have fleeting moments where I forget those times entirely. Everything is just so much better now. Naruto took another sip before releasing a sigh of delight. It really was good tea. I could barely believe it myself. I could never imagine so much could happen in only 3 years. Was this really because of Getu's death? Naruto may not have been around to see the small businessman get his throat torn out by a vengeful Zabuza, but he had at least found out that had happened while he was reviving Haku. However, for just a moment Tsunami's smile slipped a little, turning more melancholic. Actually, as bad as things were under Getu's thumb, the man at least kept the nation economically stable. With his death people celebrated, but once the initial shock and reverie died away we quickly begun to realize the country was now without leadership of any kind. We were poor already and just didn't have the resources to kickstart our economy. Naruto frowned at that, wondering just how intrinsically Getu had worked himself into this country's workings. For his death to completely destabilize it. However, we were lucky. The warmth returned to the woman's face. With the bridge completed we were once again connected to the outside world, and a young noble from High no Kuni noticed the situation we were in. He gave a substantial donation to help us get back on our feet, and everything you see here today was a result of his kind actions. That took Naruto aback for a moment, but in a good way. Such selfless altruism was rare nowadays and it was good to see. However, Tsunami quickly laughed, a delightful, tinkling sound. I'm sure he probably did it to raise his profile in the courts or some such. Naruto simply shared the laugh, secretly hoping that wasn't the case, ever the optimist. So where are Tazuna and Inari? Tsunami took a quick glance over to the brown work pants she had been repairing as Naruto asked before looking back, her soft smile back. Both are in Konoha at the moment, actually, working on the reconstruction job our nation was hired to help with. Naruto raised an eyebrow in confusion at that. Reconstruction? What happened? At that, Tsunami raised her own brow in surprise. You hadn't heard. It was very big over the recent weeks. Naruto just chuckled sheepishly, bringing a hand up to rub the back of his head. Ah, I was away from civilization for a while. You could almost say I was stuck on an island. Tsunami looked at the blonde monk oddly for a moment, sparing a glance over to Fu, who simply shook her head in moderate exasperation. Well, it seems Konoha was recently attacked. Naruto's head shot up at that, his hand freezing behind his head. Wait, attacked? By who? Was it the Akatsuki? The blonde may have been trying to sever those thin ties to his former home in his mind, but there were still innocent people there, people he didn't want harmed because the Akatsuki were looking for him. Tsunami just seemed confused by the outburst but looked up in thought anyway. No, I believe it was a place known as Soragakur that attacked them, apparently using some kind of machines that allowed them to fly. The woman chuckled lightly like she was sharing gossip between a group of young mothers. Then again, who can say what's rumor and what's the truth with all those fantastical things shinobi can do anyway? For all I know, some shinobi can walk through walls. Naruto simply frowned, thinking back to that group of flying men he remembered spotting on the boat journey over to Oni no Kuni. He had a feeling those weren't rumors at all. Supposedly they dropped explosives all over the village, and from what father told me when he came back on his last weekly break, it left a lot of the village damaged. She sighed, looking towards the picture on the wall showing their small family. At some point the ripped out portion that held Kage's face had been re-added. Naturally Inari just had to follow his grandfather, wanting to see a real-life shinobi village for himself, even if it was just to repair the buildings there. She smiled, looking up at the two and noticing how close they sat to one another with a knowing smirk. He really looked up to you two, you know. You made a large impact on him while you helped our nation. He may never become a shinobi, and I can only hope as much for my own sake, but many of his beliefs came from seeing how you both approached the world. She chuckled again, wiping a small imaginary tear from her eye as she looked out the window to where the sun was already beginning to dip below the horizon. You should see him, acting stoic and mature around the girls. She gave a poignant loom at Fu, yet on the inside he's the same kind and caring little boy Kage raised him to be. At that even Fu smiled lightly, remembering the slightly irritating little boy that had constantly tried to attack her with a wooden kunai she herself had given him. I'm glad to hear it. Tsunami smiled as she took another sip of tea before her eyes widened a little, realizing how long they had been talking. Oh, listen to me, just prattling on. Was there any particular reason you came to visit? Naruto simply chuckled and waved the woman off. After the hardship the nation had gone through, the dimple fact she could sit here and just talk without concern was a great thing. No, we were just passing through on our way to Aim no Kuni. Fu looked him with slight surprise, not having heard of this particular destination before now. She had, though. They were heading to Kaminari no Kuni to warn Kurabi of the danger Akatsuki posed. Naruto simply gave her a small glance, conveying that he would talk to her later about it in private. He had meant to tell her before, but it was a little difficult to hold a conversation with the high winds from riding atop his bird summon. "Oh, I hear that country is rather isolationist." The woman looked down in thought, but it seemed that was really the extent of her knowledge on the little rainy country, and her bright smile was back in a moment. "Well, I suppose I should offer you to stay the night. It's the least I could do after all." Naruto was about to kindly decline the offer so as not to impose on the woman's hospitality, but surprisingly Fu beat him to it. "That would be very nice, thank you Tsunami-san." The woman simply beamed as she got up, already busying herself to get the rooms ready. Sometimes it just felt she had so little to do with the two boys gone, for her father could barely be considered a man with the childish way he acted. It would be nice to have some company for a short time. The blonde looked across at his companion confusedly until she gave a small, completely out of character wink, standing up to help Tsunami and leaving Naruto just sitting there, trying not to gape in surprise. "So aim." Fu's voice was so innocent that Naruto had to blink a moment as he stared at her, wondering what this stranger had done with his Fu. After a moment he realized there had been one too many seconds of awkward silence, so he quickly joined her sitting on the cozy little bed with its crisp white linen sheets. Tsunami had apologized for the lack of space, but this was their only guest room. However, her voice had only contained a mischievous mirth as she left, leaving Naruto once again confused. Once again the stifling silence in the small room became apparent as Fu looked at the blonde queerly. "Ah yeah, aim. I never got around to telling you guys. I had meant to when we were traveling so we didn't have to involve Hinoka, but then Yuya and Haku stayed behind and it slipped my mind for the moment." Fu simply patiently waited as he explained. "I talked to Kakuzu after we fought." Seeing Fu's questioning glance he clarified, "The old man you found near me." The verdette nodded quickly. "He told me something troubling." He looked down at that, genuine concern on his features as the old Taki Nin's words played through his mind again. "It seems I am not the only one in this world who possesses the Rinnegan." He practically felt the sharp intake of breath from his friend as her orange eyes widened, wondering why he blonde had withheld something so important this long. "Isn't this a good thing? Maybe you could learn more about your abilities, or why you have those eyes. Isn't it something you wanted to know? Perhaps this person is family." Naruto nodded slowly. In a way he could probably learn some of that from the man, but not under the circumstance Fu would expect. "The man who possesses the Rinnegan is the leader of the Akatsuki, a man named Pain." An oppressive silence fell over the room as Fu simply absorbed that information. "He's our enemy." Naruto frowned, remembering how much he had thought about this in the quiet moments as they recuperated on Uzu. "I don't know, but he is the leader of the group trying to capture the Jinchuriki. It feels more like an enemy of coincidence than anything else. But is it really coincidence?" Fu looked around, her eyes burning vehemently. She loved Naruto, and anybody that was his enemy, reasons be damned, was her enemy too, not to mention this man was after her for the very same reason. What does that matter why he has the same Dujutsu? He is trying to kill us just to get at Chume and the Kyuubi. The fact he has the Rinnegan only makes him more dangerous on our end. At that she fell silent, struck dumb by her own words. It had taken a few moments to really sink in. All that power she had seen within Naruto, the overwhelming ability she herself could never hope to achieve, was in the hands of somebody trying to kill them. There was also the fact this man was probably older than Naruto and much more experienced with his own Dujutsu, with far less restrictions on how he used it if his goal was anything to go on. I just don't know." The green-haired girl looked back across, spotting the conflicted expression marring the blonde's features. She paused, her own expression softening as she realized how this must be affecting Naruto. Given that most Dujutsu were genetic traits passed between family, it was highly likely this Pain was related to Naruto, yet the blonde would no doubt have to face him at some point, under less than friendly circumstances. She could see it was slowly tearing him up inside, and she knew why. Naruto needed to seek this Pain, and while part of his reason may have been to understand any possible connection between the two, it was more to see how much a threat he was to both him and her. The blonde had only recently found out just who his family was, reconnecting with not one but two of his actual blood relatives. To now find out that he had another, only for it to be his enemy, she couldn't imagine the turmoil running through the young monk's mind. So, instead of trying to understand, she attempted to help, gently reaching across and placing her hand atop his. Naruto looked up, broken from his thoughts by the soft contact to see Fu looking at him intently. However, before he could say anything, the mint-haired girl had reached across and swiftly stolen a kiss. If you keep thinking about it right now, it will only make you stress. You will lose focus and become less effective, and that will help nobody. Sometimes you need to focus more on the most important detail instead of all of them. It sounded slightly cold, more like what a Junin might say to their genin student, but Fu tried to convey as much of her warmth and concern over her words, and it just about seemed to work as Naruto's shoulders visibly relaxed. Fu took that opportunity to lean in again, this time extending the kiss as Naruto gently reciprocated, simply enjoying Fu's presence for the moment. He was a little disappointed then when the girl gently drew away, standing up to walk over to the door as Naruto watched on, eyes slightly lidded. Slowly and almost uncharacteristically teasingly, Fu closed the door behind her, turning back to face the now mildly confused blonde. He opening his mouth to say something, but Fu was already there, a hand against his lips to quieten him as a small, but increasingly red blush crept from the bridge of her nose down to her cheeks. Do you remember what we were talking about before we were attacked on that ship? Almost instantly Naruto's cheeks reddened to match Fu's. He had a good memory after all. Slowly he took a gulp, now starting to understand why Fu had insisted on staying here tonight instead of traveling into the night. Fu, do you think that's… Again a single finger was pressed against his lips as Fu gently climbed onto the bed, now straddling Naruto's lap as she stole yet another kiss from the teen. Don't think about too many details, remember. Her voice was practically a whisper as she pulled away, a soft smile on her lips and her eyes closed. I don't know a lot about these types of things, so we do whatever is comfortable, right? Naruto found himself unable to do anything but nod, eliciting a further smile from the girl he was sure he loved. Good. It was more of a breath than a word, but Naruto had little time to ponder it as in one smooth motion Fu reached around and pulled her top off, exposing her upper body to the warm air of the room. Admittedly, this was not the first time Naruto had seen Fu like this, however in this setting, with them so intimately close, it seemed so different. Sitting there with Fu on his lap, he couldn't help but remember, or perhaps realize truly for the first time, just how beautiful the Jinchuriki was. Her caramel skin was so exotic, and that was only enhanced now she was baring her breasts, a cute, flustered blush on her cheeks as he said nothing. Slowly he pulled of his own top, just doing what felt comfortable, like Fu said. You really are beautiful, Fu. Any response the girl might have had became an unintelligible mumble as Naruto captured her lips, rolling them around so they were now properly on the bed. As if by some long-forgotten instinct his hand came up, sliding across her supple skin until they found her chest. Hesitantly, and then more confidently as her slight, quivering moans urged him on, he began to gently play with her soft, but firm breasts. It was an unfamiliar but not unwelcome visceral pleasure simply having that soft, yielding flesh in his hands, Fu's moans reverberating in his mouth as they continued their passionate kiss. It seemed perfect, however Naruto hadn't experienced anything that was to come that night yet. Chapter 78, Embers Part 2. There are two kinds of fights. As long as we place ourselves in battle, we must always know the difference, a fight to defend life or a fight to defend pride. Yukatake Jushiro. Naruto took in a long, deep breath as he gently ran his hands through Fu's verdant hair, playing with the individual strands as the girl slept, huddled against his form. They were both sweaty and the cool morning air had the hair across his body standing on end, but he still couldn't do anything but smile as the snoozing girl murmured something unintelligible into the pillow, blissfully asleep. As much as he didn't want to move from this unbelievably comfortable position, the late morning sunlight was already streaming in through the windows and they had kept Tsunami waiting for long enough. Fu. He gently shook the girl's shoulder, immediately making her curl further into the warm embrace of the covers in a vain attempt to stave off reality. In the end though, as it always did, consciousness prevailed and a bleary-eyed but still lightly smiling Jinchuriki slowly rose up, her upper body still bare. Naruto gained a light blush looking down on her body, still covered in just a thin sheen of sweat from their previous activities. It certainly brought back a lot of recent memories, very good memories. Must we get up now? The blonde raised an eyebrow. It was very unlike Fu to act petulant, even if it was only half seriously said. Then again, last night Naruto had discovered an entirely new side to Fu he had never imagined before. The very light and already fading nail marks on his back were certainly testament to that. Yeah, come on, I can smell breakfast downstairs. It was like an instant change in the girl. She practically shot out of the bed, still as naked as the day she was born. The blonde simply chuckled to himself as he watched her quickly dash about the room, gathering up clothes that had been haphazardly strewn across the room randomly. Most amusing were the fishnet shorts the two had somehow managed to lodge atop the curtain bracket. Even Naruto didn't remember how that happened. After a moment or two though, his stomach grumbled noisily and he too got up, joining Fu in her search for their elusive clothing. The two left Nami no Kuni in considerably higher spirits than when they entered, greeting people in the streets congenially and sparing a few moments to those that recognized them. Naruto was surprised and inwardly pleased and a little excited by the impact the pair had managed to make on the little nation. Many people remembered how they had helped them when the country was impoverished without asking anything in return. By the time they actually managed to reach the great bridge connecting Nami with the mainland, it was already past noon, although that didn't stop them marveling at the amazing construct. Kibo Bridge. Appropriate. Naruto had to nod at whoever decided to name the bridge that. It really was a beacon of hope, telling the downtrodden that there was always a way out and to never give up. However, there was only so long the two could spend staring at a bridge and soon they were on their way again. However, Naruto was happily surprised when Fu hesitantly linked arms with him as they walked, enjoying her body pressed up against his side as they moved through the forest. So why don't we simply fly to Aim no Kuni? They had been walking along in pleasant silence for a while, sometimes idly chatting about some of the things they had seen in Nami no Kuni. Naruto simply smirked at the question though, wondering if Fu would ask. It was almost as if he could no longer quite predict what the girl would say. It was almost as if she had changed overnight, losing some of that shy, introverted edge she had. Really, after all this time you're tired of walking? Naruto couldn't help but jest back at her. After all, she had gone silent and without complaint all these years now. Fu just gave him an even stare in return, making him chuckle half amused and half sheepishly. The girl could manage intimidating rather easily. I would think getting to a Megakure would be rather important considering what we found out. Naruto shrugged slowly. He had obviously considered the idea himself before dismissing it. The Akatsuki isn't going anywhere. In fact, if we wait long enough they would quite happily come to us. But in any case, flying would be a bad idea. We would have to cut right over High no Kuni, putting us at risk of attracting Konoha's attention. As indifferent as I profess to be to my former home, Fu raised a single eyebrow at that. I really don't want to involve them any more than I want to confront possible family. Fu's eyes narrowed briefly, searching Naruto's face for any hint that he was hiding something, but looked away, satisfied. We could fly around the bordering nations. Naruto shrugged again, more nonchalantly this time as he picked the pace up slightly, responding to Fu's subtle encouragements that she thought they should be traveling faster. Same problem really, especially as one of those nations we would have to fly over contains Tokigakure. Fu looked down at that, just the smallest of frowns briefly passing over her features. It didn't go unnoticed by the blonde and he had to suppress a slight sigh. It didn't stop him from gently placing his arm around his lover's shoulders in comfort. Just as Konoha still held less than pleasant memories for him, the scars the caramel-skinned girl had received, emotionally at least, had never truly healed. They had only been moved out of sight. Trying to move the conversation onto something other than her painful past, Fu looked up, her face molding into a picture of thought. How about summoning us there? Naruto paused in the middle of the path, looking around at Fu slightly incredulously. I would need to actually be there already to summon you. Fu nodded, walking on as Naruto moved to join her again, still staring at her strangely. It really was odd to see her so talkative, especially about such an apparently inane topic. What about a clone? Naruto almost paused again, but Fu just carried on walking, so he stopped himself before he could. You know, in all this time I have never once tried to summon myself with a clone. In fact, Naruto couldn't remember an instance where one of his clones had ever actually summoned anything. This time it was Fu who paused to look at Naruto oddly. She sometimes wondered if the teen had more power than he really knew what to do with. She had just gotten a very succinct answer. Really? What do you do all day? Naruto actually chuckled at that, looking around just in time to see Fu's slight smirk slip off her face as she masked it behind her usual placid expression, although it seemed a little strained. Well, let's see. Most recently I got up, meditated, went through my chakra control exercises. You and I had say. He received an impromptu light-hearted punch to the arm from a suddenly blushing mint-haired Jinchuriki as the verdette managed to impressively look everywhere except at her blonde traveling companion. He chuckled again at her expression, wondering just where this side of Fu had been all these years he had known her. It was like meeting a completely new person. Maybe that next step in their physical intimacy had been just what she needed to finally crack that shell around her she had built all those lonely years in Taki. It wasn't just him either. Coming through Nami he had noticed that when people would recognize them Fu would be far more animate in their conversations than she normally might. She would actually talk to them, even smiling when one or two of the younger children would call her Oni-chan. It was definitely a change Naruto could support. He enjoyed seeing the girl he loved finally breaking down those final few barriers and reintegrating herself into somewhat normalcy. You know I was joking. Naruto was snapped out of his pleasant thoughts as Fu's mumbled words reached his ears, the girl still managing to find the ground impossibly interesting. Yes I know, but you are much cuter when you blush. He nearly broke out laughing again as he spotted the shade of red that had violently invaded the bridge of her nose start to spread to the edges of her cheeks. He supposed there was still one aspect about Fu he could rely on. The teen Jinchuriki certainly didn't know how to take a compliment. Anyway, I still think the clone is a good idea. Naruto raised an eyebrow before remembering the conversation they were just having. At this point Fu had just about managed to compose herself, the blush nothing more than a light dusting of pink on her cheeks, barely noticeable with her complexion. Oh, how so? I would still have to get the clone there, even if it could summon us. Honestly, the idea of summoning himself sounded ill-advised. If something were to go wrong then there would be no way for him to fix it as it would be him it affected. However, he decided to humor the girl for a while. After all, there was little else to talk about on the long forest path that stretched off seemingly endlessly into the shade of the trees. You could henge the clone into some kind of bird, let it fly ahead and then allow it to summon us once it reached a sufficient distance. Naruto nodded for a moment in thought, however Fu immediately noticed it was put on for show. She frowned cutely, crossing her arms under her chest and unconsciously highlighting her assets. You don't have to mock the idea. Naruto quickly shook his head, an amused smile fighting against his fabricated mask of seriousness. No, it's a good idea. In fact, I can only find one flaw in it. Fu blinked, unsure of whether Naruto was actually being serious or not as she leaned in a little closer unconsciously. Naruto's voice naturally had a way of drawing one in. Joking or not, and she found herself immediately curious. What? Naruto just looked up at a random tree, hand on his chin as he struck an obviously over-exaggerated thinking pose, pausing for a few moments just for the suspense. I have no idea how to perform a henge. Fu almost face-faulted into the ground, only her natural unflappability and general poise stopping her. It didn't stop the smile from spreading over the blonde's face as he watched her incredulous reaction. How can you not know a basic technique like that? In hindsight, Fu couldn't remember an instance of Naruto ever actually using the fundamental shinobi techniques, but she had least assumed that at his power he would know something so utterly basic to even an academy student. Naruto simply gave a non-committal shrug as they continued on down the winding path. The sun was making its steady descent down the sky, so the many shadows of the trees had begun to stretch out eastward. I'm not a shinobi, remember. I don't know the basic clone or the substitution techniques either. Fu blinked at that, trying to think of an instance of her friend using either jutsu. I only know the very fundamentals of the henge from when I was trying to create an invisibility technique, not the actual technique itself. Fu nodded at that, remembering her amusement and intrigue as Naruto created what he dubbed the moving henge. So does that mean? Fu stopped mid-sentence as she noticed Naruto had stopped, a frown flashing across his brow as he looked of somewhere to the west of them. The mint-haired teen followed his gaze up to what looked like an old fortress up on a hill, only its silhouette was really visible, backed by the sun. What is it? She turned back to her friend but already saw him carrying on down the path, that same frown still marring his features. Two shinobi are fighting in an old fortress up there, powerful ones. It was strange, their signatures that he could sense through the water vapor in the air were familiar and at the same time, similar to one another. However, he couldn't quite remember where or when he had felt this chakra before. It wasn't like with his practically eidetic memory. Chakra signatures were more something he felt, and were more difficult to discern from one another. He felt as though it was right on the tip of his tongue, just as he felt another presence enter his senses, this one instantly familiar due to the sheer magnitude of it. Ah, Samahata was right then, it is you. Practically all of Naruto's muscles tensed as one as Kisami's harsh tone sounded through the forested area, quickly followed by the very same man walking out of the tree line. He wore the usual Akatsuki robe along with an all-too cocky grin as he lugged the massive wrapped sword atop his shoulder. You know, Samahata has been bugging me for a long while now to come and find you, little monk. It just can't get enough of your delicious chakra. I don't know what it is, Samahata just says you taste like an all-you-can-eat buffet. Naruto almost quirked an eyebrow at the large wrapped sword that was practically vibrating in anticipation atop the former Kirinin's shoulder. What does the Akatsuki want now? I thought you couldn't come after me until the other Biju were sealed. Kisame raised his brow at that, his smirk widening to show a row of sharp and suitably shark-like teeth. Well, aren't we a well-informed little monk? Naruto simply remained impassive. He had learned a lot more than about the Akatsuki's leader from Kakuzu. Kisami's grin never slipped even as a tense silence fell over the group, each knowing that the first to move would be the one to instigate the fight. In any case, I'm not here for the Akatsuki. He looked up in mock thought, a hand coming up to his chin in a casual gesture that seemed out of place in the tense situation, although I suppose this will further the goal. Naruto began slowly building up his chakra, feeling for the nature energy surrounding them and drawing it in as slowly and subtly as possible. Fu had told him what she knew of the two Akatsuki members they had yet to actually face in a fight, and her information on the former Kurigakure shinobi was surprisingly in-depth. Apparently Kisame hadn't exactly been subtle in his skills while he was still working as a hunter nin. His massive chakra reserves were well known, thus his nickname of the tailless-tailed beast. There was also his sword, Samahata, a sentient weapon with the ability to absorb chakra as it shaved into the enemy. Of course, as a member of the Akatsuki he would have only gotten stronger in his time as a nuke nin, at least on par with the others they had faced and probably stronger. No, this is for Samahata, not Akatsuki. I like to treat my blade every once in a while. Now hold still so Samahata can have a little taste. Anything else the massive blue-skinned man might have said was lost as Fu suddenly shot forward, a crisp orange cloak of chakra appearing around her body faster than a civilian could blink. Two vicious swords of water appeared in her hands, stained violet by the cloak of chakra, as her rapidly beating pair of wings took her on a low skimming path across the ground. However, Kisame simply remained in place, actually swinging his still bandaged sword off his shoulder just to rest it on the ground casually. What, you thought I would come alone? Fu didn't make it halfway across the distance between them before the ground in front of her was blown outward in a conflagration of flame and broken earth. She diverted her course in time, pulling up so harshly she felt the sudden shift in direction pull at her bones uncomfortably. Haha, I finally get to prove to you my art, yeah. Naruto sucked in air through his teeth as he looked up, spotting the form of the blonde Akatsuki he thought Fu had dealt with back in Mizu no Kuni. He rode on a large white dragon, probably made of clay given what Fu had told him about the crazy artist. He hadn't sensed him because he was too high up, well out of his passive range. He worried that meant the Akatsuki knew about his water sense, or at least were preparing against the possibility. Your fights with me, Nanabe. Before Fu could decide what to do, an entire flock of small clay figures, no larger than hummingbirds and shaped to match, swarmed from the surrounding trees and shot right at her like deadly little bullets. Naruto watched with slightly narrowed eyes as the mint-haired Jinchuriki was chased into the tree line, disappearing into the shade as she weaved around trees in an attempt to shake her small but maneuverable pursuers. Deidara laughed with an insane glee as his own mount dived down to chase after them and witness the result of his art. Naruto and the blue-skinned swordsman were left alone again, a harsh quiet settling back down even as dulled, muffled explosions echoed through the forest. Ooh, so cold leaving your little girlfriend alone with the mean old artist. From what I was told about you, I had expected you to go running off at the first sign your friend was in trouble. Kisami's smirk took on a more vicious edge as he hefted his sword back up into a more offensive stance, He was naturally the type to play about with his opponents, but this young teen had taken down Sasori and Kakuzu. He was not one to be underestimated. Fu can handle herself, I trust her. Despite Naruto's confident, even tone, he couldn't quell the small spark of worry he felt in his chest for the teen. True, she had dealt with Deidara before, but at the time they had thought he was soundly defeated. The other blonde now had only time to prepare to face Fu again, and he didn't want to know what the twisted artist had come up with for his friend. How did you know we would be here? Kisame grinned, ignoring the agitated vibrations from his sword as it practically begged him to start fighting already. That's the best thing, isn't it? I had no idea you would be here. Me and Deidara were just supposed to keep people away from the two up there. Us meeting up is just a coincidence. He causally motioned to the massive fortress built into the hill where Naruto could still feel those same two shinobi fighting with a large, careless swing of his sword. Samahata can feel your chakra from miles away though, no matter how hard you suppress it, the smell is just too exquisite for it. Naruto spared a glance to the sword which was still quivering just from being in proximity to him. He supposed it must be all the biju inside of him. However, it seemed Kisame had grown tired of simply talking as the massive blade was finally raised into an offensive stance. I suppose there is no peaceful way to settle this. Naruto supposed he had to try at least, even if the cruel glint in Kisame's beady eyes told him everything he needed to know. Of course there is. Naruto raised an eyebrow but didn't allow the tension to leave his body. He had nearly gathered enough chakra to enter sage mode. You come with us quietly and allow us to rip the biju out of you and your little girlfriend. The shark-like man grinned even wider as he took a step forward, hefting his weapon to point at the young monk. I'll even spare you one of your arms or legs, how's that sound? Naruto simply released a single breath in a long sigh as he closed his eyes, mildly disappointed. Sorry, no deal. When his eyes slowly opened again, they burned the color of molten gold, the air around him shimmering with repressed chakra. One of Fu's shimmering wings of chakra carelessly shaved through the trunk of an old tree as she ducked and weaved in tight arcs as she once again found herself trying to outrun the annoyingly persistent creations of the former Iwagakure shinobi. She could feel him, flying up above her and occasionally throwing taunts down at her, mixed in with new swarms of his lethal sculptures. The tree behind her crashed to the ground, taking out a few of the little white hummingbirds that in turn exploded and carved great swaths from their numbers. In that brief moment or respite, a single arm of bright glowing chakra shot from her cloak, grabbing onto a nearby sturdy bough and allowing her to swing up in a much tighter maneuver than the clay birds could match. Deidara's eyes widened when he suddenly found Fu careening up towards him, moving so fast that the air at the edge of her flickering wings created small white trails. He tried to force his mount to turn out of her flight path, but it was too late, and not a moment later a spinning blur of orange drilled straight through the much larger dragon. Before the bomber could even detonate the clay, the corrosive properties of the biju shroud infected the pure white substance, wresting control away from him and allowing the dragon to fall harmlessly to the ground, already dissolving without the magnificent explosion he had been waiting for. Don't deny me my art, yeah. Fu came to a hovering stop some distance above him, having had to slow down her spin without completely throwing herself off and losing control of her wings. It was always harder to use her drilling spin going up, but she managed, coming out of it in an elegant arc, looking down at Deidara with that same emotionless, disinterested expression that seemed to irritate him so much last time. Sure enough, a scowl broke out over his features as he thrust his hands back into the pouches on his waist. Fu noted that he had brought a lot more than he had last time. Don't underestimate me, He slapped his hands together, and when he brought them apart, 3 small clay dragons were wrapped around his wrists. They didn't stay that size for long though, and soon Fu was staring down at 3 large white dragons, each the size of the blonde's previous mount. You're nothing more than a test. A stepping stone for my art to reach the next level and finally be enough for him. He spat the last word in contempt as he shot a scathing look towards the fortress that lay silently below them in the waning light of the evening. He didn't seem entirely focused on the fight, so Fu decided to remind him that he was in the middle of a fight as she darted down. Deidara looked around to see Fu take a deep breath, her chakra-shrouded chest expanding much more than should have been physically possible before she breathed out an enormous cloud of glittering dust that immediately caught the dimming light streaming over the horizon, reflecting it so many times it was like a small sun hovering in the sky. However, the mint-haired girl wasn't prepared for Deidara to suddenly burst through the cloud of dust, His long blonde bang moved to cover his usually exposed eye to reveal some kind of device over the other. A grin alighted on his face as he saw his opponent caught unawares, signaling for two of the dragons to break off and encircle the girl. You think I wouldn't be prepared for your tricks? Your art is stale and lacks vision. My art is only evolving, growing and becoming better, because my art is an explosion. Fu braced her body for the explosion she had been expecting, however there was no flash of light or burn of fire. Instead, she was surprised to feel something soft and sticky wrap around her body, and when he opened her eyes she saw that the two dragons had indeed exploded, but into a softer, almost liquid clay that had proceeded to cover her in a bubbling white paste. His eyes widened at the implications of that even as Deidara's grin widened, his hands moving into an all too familiar hand seal. Katsu. The sky lit up in a plethora of yellows and oranges as a great plume of flame rose into the sky, quickly washed away as a great shockwave of air ripped across the sky, scattering clouds and blowing smoke across the entire area. Deidara strained his eyes to peer through the smoke, looking for the falling, charred body he wanted to see. He had seen how the girl moved the last time they fought, and he knew he had to somehow restrict her movements if he wanted to catch her in his art. Clouds began to gather above him, darkening the sky as the low rumbles of thunder began to make themselves known. Slowly rain began to fall, dispersing the dust enough for Deidara's enhanced eye to pick out a small, curled-up form within the smoke. Slowly Fu unraveled her body, the bubbling, incoherent six-tailed cloak she had been forced to form slowly receding into her body until only wings remained to keep her aloft. Her body was littered in light burns and her clothing was charred, but she was otherwise unhurt. Deidara's eyes narrowed in rage as his hand curled into a fist. However, before his scathing, enraged remark could leave his lips, the sky chose that moment to unleash its wrath. The first strike cracked the earth beneath Naruto's feet as he blocked it with a thick black rod of chakra. Kisami's strength was immense, but with nature energy surging through his system, Naruto was actually stronger, and bit by bit he was able to start pushing the larger man back. However, Kisame wasn't a master swordsman for nothing and was easily able to use Naruto's momentum against him, allowing the younger teen to lunge forward as he suddenly changed his grip, spinning around to gouge a pound out of the blonde's back. Samahata met its mark but only received a few strips of cloth and a cascade of sparks for its efforts as it ground against the monk's tough Asura path before Naruto jumped away. The Rinnegan bearer frowned as he shucked his light, airy Haori, leaving him in just his loose brown pants and traditional sandals. The chakra rod in his hand crumbled away into dust as the chakra holding it together finally fell apart, too much of it absorbed by the hungry blade. It would appear he would need something more permanent to face such a blade wielded by such a skilled swordsman. His hands were quickly wreathed in blue and red flames before being brought together. Banbutsu Suzu, Tenbogiri, he brought his hands apart and in between them a long, intricately carved wooden pole began to appear, engraved lovingly with light golden patterns of winding vines that looked so detailed it was as if the plants themselves wreathed the shaft. At the base of the weapon a long plume of fine red threads cascaded down, brushing the floor gently. The top though was tipped by a razor-sharp and curved blade that glinted dangerously in the dimming light trickling through the trees. In under a few seconds Naruto was carefully holding a long, gleaming naginata in his hands that even Kisame had to stop and appreciate for a few moments. Hey, nice blade, bit of a presumptuous name though, don't you think? Naruto simply allowed a small smile to tweak up on the corners of his mouth as he settled back into what looked like a well-practiced stance, his weight towards his back foot. Why don't you find out? Kisame grinned broadly as he once again altered the grip on his blade, opting for a strong one-handed grip, and he rushed forward, the ground under his feet bursting back as he sped forward. His first lunge was dodged as Naruto slipped to the side, using the advanced senses nature energy gave him to preemptively predict the strike. He ducked under the follow-up swipe that passed over his head, so close he could spot the individual scales writhing beneath the clean white bandages wrapping the blade. He tried to sweep Kisami's legs out from under him, but the man simply drove his sword into the ground, blocking the finely crafted naginata from connecting. Hey, you're good kid, but stick to stuff you know, blades are my thing. Naruto just smirked as he revealed the hand he had taken off his blade to point at Kisami's chest. Good advice, Shinra Tensai. With his blade planted firmly into the ground, Kisame didn't even have time to widen his eyes before his body was wrenched backwards by a bone-crunching invisible force. Naruto gazed into the small line of destruction the large Akatsuki member had gouged through the forest. After a few tense moments he staged back into the small clearing they had been using as a battleground. His robe was hanging off his body so he quickly shucked it, leaving him in the same state of dress as Naruto. I didn't think you. Monks were the eye for an eye type of people. Naruto shrugged nonchalantly as he span his blade and returned to a ready stance next to where Samahata was still planted eye on the ground. He would have to keep Kisame as far from that blade as possible to give him enough advantage to finish this quickly and get to Fu. I liked that Haori. Kisame grinned as he spat out a wad of blood, experimentally twisting his torso to make sure he had full maneuverability. However, before either could make another move, rain began to fall from dark, angry clouds that hadn't been there a few minutes ago. Moments later there was an enormous flash of light as the skies were viciously rent open. Chapter 79, Embers Part 3. It is our choices that show us what we truly are, far more than our abilities. J.K. Rowling. Everyone for a mile around the old Uchiha fortress froze. Looking up towards the heavens as a great beast of pure light roared for one long, inexplicable moment. Vaguely, a single-minute figure could be seen hovering in the sky, framed by the light of the magnificent beast of energy, but only for a fleeting moment before it was sent crashing back into the fortress. Naruto and his swordsman opponent had done their best to ignore the great gouts of flame being sent careening into the clouds, even as they had caused a small storm to gather and rain to fall. However, something like this was impossible to ignore. Up in the sky the bomber and the Nanabi Jinchuriki were likewise transfixed by the incredible sight, at least until some lingering electricity up in the clouds caused Deidara to wince as a stray arc ran the length of his arm. Both were snapped out of their dazes as Fu's reformed wings burst into action, sending the lithe teen right at the former Iwanin. The crazed blonde wasn't caught unaware though as he threw his hands out, crafting small but deadly birds of clay with astounding speed, throwing them out one by one on an intercepting course with the incoming drill of a girl. Katsu. The thin, insectoid wings naturally curled around the verdette on some base instinct as the familiar cry sounded out above the harsh pelting of the rain. However, when no intense explosion came, no burning sensation as the air around her was set alight, Fu hesitantly uncurled. Deidara's creations were struggling just to stay airborne, never mind explode. In fact, one or two had already slowed down enough to drop from the sky. The girl floated there in the air, watching the little sculptures carefully as they flew on by her lamely. She even swatted one away with the back of her hand only for it to practically dissolve and fall from the sky. A quick glance over to Deidara told her this was not part of any plan if his angered and frustrated expression was anything to go on. Even the massive dragon he was riding on seemed to struggle to move its mighty white wings, and the only reason it seemed to have not succumbed to its fellow artwork's fate was the hand Deidara had firmly pressed against its head. Fu only realized what was going on when she noticed that the fine hairs on the back of her arms had risen slightly due to the intense lingering electricity in the atmosphere. Earth chakra. She nodded to herself. Deidara's sculptures must have relied on some form of perverse earth-natured chakra, so naturally lightning would be its weakness. The tiniest flicker of a smirk crossed the Nanabi Jinchuriki's features as she floated there in the sky before flashing through a set of rapid hand seals. Sweeten. Mizukiri. Water from the atmosphere, of which there was plenty thanks to the lingering storm clouds, gently condensed around her clenched fist until a long thin katana made of pure water rested in her grip. It was her own personal refinement. Of her former village's famous water-cutting sword, sacrificing substance for a keener edge. It would last long against any normal sword, or even most strong jutsu, however for her purpose it was perfect. Don't get cocky Jinchuriki, a sword isn't going to help you here. Not when you can't even get close to me, yeah. Fu didn't say anything, focusing on the blade in her hand and the way her chakra ran through it, converted to water nature as it left the tenketsu in her palm. Slowly she altered the chakra, rubbing it and exciting it until a small, chirping-like noise filled the space around her and the water sword began to glow with a brilliant inner light. Her hand began to vibrate uncontrollably and a wince passed over her features so she quickly pulled up a one-handed ram seal before slowly and meticulously passing through the one-handed seals Haku had taught her. It had taken the pair a long time to figure out just how to use this particular ninjutsu, drawing on Haku's experience combining chakra natures and Fu's natural abilities to weather the failures. It was always dangerous to work with lighting chakra, especially when you weren't quite sure what it was you were trying to do. However, with Fu's natural healing, she could plow through the pain of a few shocks. Though that didn't stop the irritation she felt when the blade still caused her hand to go numb, but with the burns littering her arms, that may have been a mixed blessing. Raiden. Arashikiri. The crackling in the air stopped, replaced by a low, irritating hum that had the hairs on the back of Deidara's neck rise. However, he tried to put that off as he finally felt his chakra return to normal, no longer affected by the lingering electricity in the air. "Ha. Too late, girly. Time to appreciate my art, yeah." The clay dragon he was riding seemed to regain its normal movement as its wing beats grew stronger, lifting the mad bomber higher into the sky. Fu ignored him though, focusing on the blade in her hand as the quiet hum grew louder, matching the rain pouring against both their skin. Deidara's eye twitched dangerously as he stamped his foot on the dragon once, the large, bulbous tail that seemed to be made from many increasingly smaller balls of clay shortened by a single ball. A moment later, in a smaller, chibi version of the dragon was spat from his mount's mouth, unfurling and shooting down at Fu in one smooth motion. "Cat's ga." Deidara tried to cry out his signature line but was drowned out as three things happened near simultaneously. Fu's eyes snapped up to the incoming missile, a crisp orange cloak of burning chakra surrounded her form, and she brought the hand holding her blade around in one smooth arc. The red-stained blade of water and lightning snapped out, elongating to almost ridiculous proportions as it sliced straight through the little clay dragon, causing it to harmlessly split in two neat halves before falling to the earth, rendered inert by the lightning chakra. However, it hadn't stopped there. Deidara felt the word choke in his throat as he gulped once, shakily bringing his head around to look as a thin line of red slowly spread around the circumference of his left arm. Not even a moment later he cried out in agony as a massive spurt of blood sprayed through the air. The white dragon he rode slowly split apart, the two halves falling to meet its smaller counterpart and allowing Deidara to drop down with them. The former Iwa Nin barely seemed to notice the fact he was falling. His eyes were transfixed by his left arm, or more specifically the stump that had once been his arm. The arm itself was falling beside him, just out of reach and steaming from where it had been cleanly sliced through. The blonde bomber was lucky the supercharged attack had cauterized the wound even as it was slicing through, or he probably would have already gone into severe shock from the blood loss. As it was, he was able to shakily grit his teeth, contorting his body in midair so his one workable arm could reach around into the pouch by his side. However, even as he was turning, he could only cry out again as bright bolts of searing pain lanced up his right arm. Fu had met his dive, screaming down towards him and stabbing what remained of her jutsu, now a mere flickering dagger of water, right into his exposed hand, the tip of the blade, stained red for an entirely different reason now, emerging from Deidara's one remaining mouth hand. "Arg, damn it, you bitch." Deidara tried to punch the girl off of him, but he could barely make a fist from how numb and stiff his hand had gone. In any case, Fu pushed off of him, only adding to his momentum as he fell and creating distance between them in case he had anything else up his sleeve. The chakra cloak had receded. It was only there to minimize the damage her jutsu would do to herself after all, and maintaining it for too long would only be detrimental, Chome helping her or not. She watched dispassionately as a large dust cloud was raised where Deidara crashed into the ground, her wings quickly beating to bring her down to the ground. She wasn't going to be fooled by a decoy and let him escape this time. "Suiden. Suikuden no Jutsu." Kisami's voice roared above the sound of the pelting rain as the water drops were absorbed into his growing technique, a great shark of glowing blue water that hung over his head before shooting forward, swimming through the air like it was water. However, it harmlessly dispersed as it slammed into a wall of invisible, unpassable force that carried on through the technique, ripping up the ground and nearly throwing Kisame back through the trees again had the large blue man not flickered out of the way in a well-timed shunshin. Shinra Tensai. Naruto lowered his arm, his burning golden eyes searching throughout the clearing for any sign of his opponent. He had managed to maintain his position near where Samahata was still planting into the ground, but Kisame was making it difficult for him to stay there. The superior swordsman had already managed to disarm him of the Naginata, proving that even without his iconic blade he was a force to be reckoned with. Naruto had also painfully learned that his Preta path was all but useless against Kisami's water jutsu, as even if he absorbed the chakra in them, the force of the water was still enough to hurt him. Right now though, it felt as though Kisame was merely playfully poking at his defense, testing it out in order to find his limits. He never stayed in one spot long enough for Naruto to try and grab him with a Bansho Tenon. It was coming to almost the point where Naruto felt like leveling the clearing around them in order to smoke him out. However, his eyes flashed with victory as he felt Kisame pause in the trees through his water sense, his chakra building up for a jutsu. Instantly Naruto's hands found themselves instinctually grabbing the ram seal as his head flicked around to his target. Geto, Kusari. There was a momentary sound of struggle along with Kisame's grunts and muttered curses, but after a few seconds the large shark-like man was brought into the clearing, bound almost head to toe in deep obsidian chains tipped with vicious hooks. Naruto didn't particularly enjoy the rather cruel appearance of his outer path's chains, but they were certainly useful. Hehe, so this is the power of the Rinnegan. It's so frightening. Despite his situation, Kisame still had that same self-satisfied smirk on his face, although he couldn't hold back the occasional wince as he felt his chakra being slowly siphoned away through the black chains. What did the Akatsuki want with the Biju? Despite the information Kakazu had given, that was the one thing the ancient Taki nin couldn't answer. Kisame just chuckled though, glancing about at his restraints as though Naruto wasn't even there. This is pretty interesting, never seen Leader Sama use this one before. It almost reminds me of that annoying, loudmouth redhead I fought all those years ago. The vicious grin returned as he glanced back towards the blonde again. Didn't help her back then either. Suishin. Dai Bakusui Shoha. Naruto barely had time to widen his eyes as Kisame's chest suddenly puffed out before the swordsman spewed out an absurd amount of water. Enough that he should have died from dehydration more than 100 times over from it. The crushing pressure of the gout was enough to break Naruto's concentration as he was swept away from the blue-skinned man and his now freed sword. However, moments later he felt the flow of the water change, now drawing him in, back towards the epicenter. He didn't hear the name of the jutsu being called out, but he could see its effects as an enormous dome of water was formed atop the forest, bending trees with its enormous weight. Naruto had to marvel at the magnitude of the jutsu. For such a thing to be possible when Kisame wasn't even a Jinchuriki was astounding. The dome of water even eclipsed the hill and fortress nearby, now blurred and unrecognizable from within. Naruto floated there for a moment, calming himself down so his body wouldn't use more oxygen than it needed to. However, his eyes widened as he felt a presence approaching rapidly. Only a burst of wind chakra from the tenketsu across his right side managed to move him out of the way in time for a speeding creature to go shooting past, inches from carving into him with sharp claws and glinting teeth. It had only been for a moment, but Naruto's Rinnegan had managed to capture every inch of Kisame's frightening transformation. He couldn't be sure, but the blonde suspected Kisame had somehow fused with Samahata as the blade was nowhere to be seen. The shark-like traits of the man had been exaggerated tenfold, a large fin sprouting from his back as his body grew and morphed to accommodate its new aquatic needs. Even as he was figuring this out, the swordsman was coming around for another pass. This time Naruto was sure he wouldn't be fooled by a burst of chakra to move him out the way. Instead he brought his hands up into an old classic, a seal he hadn't used in a while. Kage Bunshin no Jutsu. The words were muffled by the water, but the effect was unchanged as 5 copies of the monk popped into existence, his refined chakra control making it so there wasn't even a burst of smoke to herald their arrival. Instantly each clone began swimming off in a different direction, using bursts of well-timed chakra to power their way through the water as quickly as possible to escape the dome. Kisame spun to a stop where they had been, looking at each of the fleeing clones in turn before a cruel smirk grew on his flattened features. Using the shark's tail that came with his transformation, Kisame suddenly powered straight down in a seemingly random direction away from any of the fleeing clones. However, it was quickly revealed there was method in the seeming madness as his clawed and webbed hands shot forward, raking through seemingly empty water. However, his grin only grew as 4 lines of blood rewarded his efforts as a 6th Naruto shimmered back into the visible spectrum, wincing from the new wound across his chest. Silly monk. I can sense everything in this dome, visible or not. Oddly, the man's voice seemed unimpaired by the water and carried to the blonde. Easily, his cruel, playful tone not lost on his ears as he clutched at his chest. Kisame quirked a brow when Naruto said something, however it only came out as bubbles, so whatever was said was lost on the shark-like being. However, the laugh at the end wasn't missed in the slightest, and before Kisame could spin around to lash out with his tail, the Naruto in front of him disappeared in a burst of smoke. His beady black eyes widened in surprise. That hadn't been a clone, he was absolutely certain of it. Samahata could detect things like that easily. Outside the water dome, one of the clones Kisame had deemed unimportant enough not to chase down watched curiously as the ceiling matrix faded away, leaving a blinking but at least in one piece Naruto standing there, looking over his body frantically. Once he was sure everything had come across in the summoning, he grinned with a small unnoticeable sigh of relief. Good thing that worked, boss. Naruto looked up, remembering his clone was still there and remembering how the copies usually liked to address him. It really had been a while since he used them in any significant way, and now the technique might have just saved his life. Yeah, I'll have to thank Fu for the idea later, even if it was unwholesomely reckless. Who knew what could have gone wrong with Naruto trying to summon himself? The sheer statement made one want to scratch their head in confusion. At least it was good to know it worked for the future. Maybe it's better she doesn't find out. Both blondes paused for a moment before giving a simultaneous nod. At the same moment, small shivers ran down their spines. They didn't think that the fact it was her idea would dissuade Fu from the fact Naruto had done something that he himself had called needlessly reckless. Both monks were snapped out of their momentary pause by the joint memory of a not-so-lucky clone being viciously ripped into by the still amphibious Kisame, no doubt looking for the real one amongst the stragglers. Naruto's features hardened as he looked back towards the dome, the clone disappearing into smoke behind him as he began to run towards it. However, instead of diving in, he began running up the surface, showing a remarkable combination of surface clinging and water walking simultaneously. His sprint was short-lived as he was suddenly forced to dive out of the way of a leaping pair of watery jaws. He managed to stay on the surface of the water, but without his forward momentum, and thanks to the odd angle of the dome it proved difficult to stay that way. He got to his feet and started running again, using bursts of wind chakra to propel himself up, dodging more and more watery sharks as they appeared from the dome seemingly without warning. Luckily, in Sage mode, Naruto's senses were heightened to the maximum, almost like a form of brief precognition, at least as far as hostile intent went, and he was able to reach the top of the dome. Looking down into the clear waters, he managed to catch a glimpse of Kisame just finishing off the last of the clones within the dome. The blue-skinned creature that the swordsman had become barely managed to look up to where the original was stood before the blonde monk slammed his hands down onto the surface of the water. Shinra Tensei. Now, Naruto could have expected many things to happen as he sent that enormous wave of pure gravitational force through that dome of water, such as a large shockwave, or for the force being spread out too much amongst the medium for there to be much an effect beyond being a deterrent. However, he had certainly not been expecting the entire dome to suddenly quiver dangerously, nor for Kisame to suddenly writhe inside his own jutsu, blood coming from his mouth and ears in great inky sprays that spread out around him, turning the water pink. The intense gravitational wave had not caused a shockwave like Naruto had expected. Instead, it had simply ramped up the already large pressure inside the dome by increasing the weight of every single molecule of water by a factor of almost 10. Kisame's body couldn't handle the sudden water pressure, akin to being at the bottom of the ocean, and despite his body's changes to accommodate aquatic life, no amount of induced transformation could have prepared him for forces that could rend steel like it was paper. Naruto's eyes widened in surprise when the jutsu beneath him was released, the water pouring out in a great tidal wave in every direction. He struggled to maintain his balance as the water level dropped all the way to the ground, but just about managed it, landing softly on now very wet earth. The destruction the released jutsu had caused was truly remarkable. Trees in every direction for over a mile were rent back, bent like reeds on a riverbank. Now Naruto had to somehow locate his opponents in all this mess. He sighed before stretching out his senses. At least there was plenty of water to spread his chakra through now. Fu's wings fluttered once before allowing her to drop to the dusty ground with barely a whisper, quickly folding into her back before fading away as the chakra once again became insubstantial. Slowly and carefully, without taking her eyes off his body for a moment, the girl walked towards Deidara's unmoving form. Only the occasional twitch as his body convulsed gave away the fact he was still alive, whether it was from the electricity from her jutsu or the pain of losing an arm she didn't know. A light groan escaped his lips as she finally stood over him, wondering what to do with him. The decision had been taken from her last time by the bomber's impromptu self-detonation, which had obviously been a decoy, however now he was really here, in the flesh. It would be easy to kill him, to create a water sword and separate his head from his shoulders. He would never be able to hurt anybody ever again. More importantly, he would never be able to come after the two of them ever again, and the Akatsuki would once again be down a member. However, a small voice in the back of her mind stayed her hand and made her pause to think what Naruto might do. She wasn't entirely sure herself. The blonde's was a difficult mindset to assume. He always seemed to find a way of resolving things without killing, for better or for worse. She looked down at Deidara. He was broken, crippled and at her mercy. If she walked away, it would only give him a shot at her back. Missing arms could be reattached, wounds healed, but hatred festered and only grew with time. To leave Deidara alive would simply be leaving one more enemy for them to face in the future, and he would only learn from his mistakes and grow stronger. However, once again her hand was stayed as it clenched into a fist. She was no longer Takigaku's weapon. The honed and trained killer they had turned her into. She didn't want that life anymore. There was already so much blood on her hands. Her gaze hardened again. She had killed people far more innocent than this man, under the orders of people far worse. What was one more stain on her soul? Naruto would never kill this man, but maybe that was why she was here, to do the things that he couldn't. To protect him where he would only make himself vulnerable. She could do that for him. She could be Naruto's weapon because she could choose to be. She could do the things he wouldn't let himself do, yet still had to be done nonetheless. Problems didn't solve themselves just because you wanted them to. After all, you had to put in some effort on your part, even if it wasn't something you would enjoy doing. In her indecision though, she left herself open to attack, and it seemed the blonde Iwa Nin was coherent enough to realize this as he suddenly grabbed her leg with his remaining arm. He pulled, throwing the Jinchuriki off balance before launching himself at her, scratching and clawing at her until he was on top of the girl. He wore a manic, crazed grin as blood dribbled from the corner of his mouth, using his good arm to tear off the tattered remains of his Akatsuki cloak. Fu couldn't help the grimace as she saw the bomber had another large mouth, this time right over his heart. This is it, Nanabi Jinchuriki. This is my final art. This is what will shake the world and forever emblazon my name in the minds of this land as the greatest artist. Slowly his skin began to become translucent, highlighting what Fu at first thought were veins but quickly realized were chakra pathways. They had become black and thick enough to be visible, something that certainly wasn't healthy. You can run, but you can't run far enough. His body slowly faded away, just leaving the black lines of his chakra pathway in the shape of his form. Because art, Fu began running, her legs not moving fast enough for her as the black lines began to converge around the bomber's former heart, compacting and condensing. Wings sprung from her back to propel herself forward, but it wasn't enough. She still just couldn't get away fast enough. Is an explosion. There was a moment of utter serenity and silence before Fu knew nothing but white. Naruto had found Kisame within the minute, his limb body laying lamely on the ground, his chest barely rising and falling. Whatever transformation he had been under was reversed, and Samahata was lying a few feet away, looking equally damaged, with the bindings having come undone to reveal the blue scaly thing that lay hidden beneath. Many of its scales were broken and the sword itself seemed to be whimpering on the ground, trying to slowly edge towards its master. Moments later Naruto had both the sword and the swordsman bound in his chains again, to make sure they wouldn't try anything again. Kisame was in a kneeling position with his head low and his arms pulled out to either side, except this time Naruto had also summoned a good portion of sand to restrain the rest of his body to prevent his repeating the same maneuver. The blonde sat down, letting his injuries get to him as he gently rubbed the gashes across his chest. He would need to see to those soon, but for now. Why are the Akatsuki collecting the Biju? What does your organization gain from all this? Kisame chuckled weakly, still managing to wear that same grin, although it seemed decidedly less cocky when he was bound in this way. Please Gaki, what makes you think I would say anything? Naruto's eyes narrowed slightly as he rocked forward, crossing his legs to get more comfortable. Kakuzu said something similar. Kisame let out a choked laugh at that, some blood escaping the corner of his mouth as he did. Nice try, but if you want to be intimidating to someone like me, gain a few years first, then a few pounds. Naruto kept his face stony as he rocked back again, pondering what to do at this point. You'll eventually tell, I have other ways of finding out after all. Kisame merely grinned. The Akatsuki knew there was no way he was escaping this. He was too low on chakra and Samahata was too damaged to help him there. However, all he needed was a single opportunity, an opportunity that came as the ground suddenly shook violently, a single beam of light stretching high into the sky far from them before a single second of silence. Naruto and Kisame both were transfixed as an enormous explosion, larger than anything the two could have imagined, reached into the sky, possible a mile in radius. Naruto stared in shock at the titanic blast, his concentration on the chains binding Kisame slipping as he stared in horror. The shark-like man swiped the opportunity, wrenching against his restraints so that his neck was free and quickly spitting out a ball of water to surround himself. He was still bound in the chains, but the sand had sloughed off him, too heavy to maintain its shape due to the water. His muscles bulged incredibly as he brought a single hand up to prick his thumb on one of his sharpened, shark-like teeth. Naruto turned just in time to see him run through the last hand seal, pressing his palm against the edge of the water prison. Suppose you won't be getting that information now. But that was a good fight, Gaki. Kuchio's no jutsu. A burst of smoke filled the small sphere of water, dissipating to reveal Kisame had summoned a small pack of sharks that made quick work of attacking him in his bloodied, defeated state. Naruto tried to pull the man out of there with the chains, but the sharks had bitten clean through them in their attempts to tear away at the swordsman's flesh. The former Kiri-nin simply closed his eyes and bore it all in perfect, stoic silence. Naruto couldn't tear his eyes away from the horrific sight of his enemy being eaten alive by his own summons until the sphere of water had turned completely red. For another few seconds he simply stared in disbelief, wondering just what could drive a man to do such a thing in the name of an organization like the Akatsuki. He would have to come back and give his enemy a proper burial, if there was anything left of him that was, but for now. The blonde raced off in the direction of the blast, the massive corona of light still hanging there in the sky. On the way he absently grabbed his shikuju from where he had planted it in the ground earlier. Oddly, it didn't even look wet, but Naruto had little time to ponder that as he raced towards his friend and lover, praying that she was okay. Fu's eyes blinked open, calming her breathing when she realized she hadn't felt the searing heat or blinding agony of the blast she had been trying to outrun. In fact, all she had felt in those last few seconds was an odd, distorting feeling that left her with an uncomfortable sensation in her stomach. She saw nothing but cloudy gray skies above her as well as trees that seemed to be bent at rather odd angles. Good, you weren't knocked unconscious. Fu was instantly on alert at the deep, resonating voice, jumping to her feet and darting her eyes about until they landed on a man up in a nearby tree. Her muscles tensed as she saw the signature black cloak with red clouds of the Akatsuki as well as the orange, swirled mask that hid the man's face from her. Oh, so hostile to the one who saved your life. Fu simply narrowed her eyes, making the man sigh as he leapt from the tree branch to land near her. So predictably dull. I suppose you're wondering why a member of the Akatsuki saved your life. Or perhaps how. He turned his head, looking towards where the bright blast was still raging in the sky, not looking like it was going to burn out anytime soon. It really was a rather remarkable technique. Fu didn't allow her confusion to get to her. It didn't matter how she had been taken miles from the blast in what appeared to be a split second, but why? I'm Toby, by the way, not that it really matters. In any case, I saved you because having you dead would simply be an inconvenience, something you and that blonde-haired friend of yours just seem to love doing to me nowadays. Fu kept a wary eye on the man, controlling her chakra in preparation for a technique. However, this simply made the man sigh again, this time in mild irritation. Oh, very well, if it will make you feel better. He opened his arms out wide and Fu wasted absolutely no time in darting forward. The ground beneath her feet began crushed into two small craters by the force of her run. She came to a skidding stop behind the man, her quickly created water sword disappearing as she turned, a frown on her face. She had clearly cut right through the man, but there was no resistance whatsoever, like he wasn't even there. Satisfied yet? Fu's frown deepened as she raced back around, slashing over and over again at the man who wore the Akatsuki's uniform, but to no effect. He simply stood there and allowed all her blows to pass right through his body. Finally she stopped, taking a few steps back and allowing her water sword to dissipate again. However, she kept her guard up in case it was some kind of ploy. What do you want? The mint-haired girl could practically feel the cruel smile the man was giving her behind the mask as he stopped forward, finally casting some light on his mask so that Fu could see what lay behind the single darkened eyehole. That's simple, I want you to kill the man you love. The blood-red eye hidden in the darkness of the mask spun hypnotically as he spoke, each syllable becoming more and more muffled as Fu felt her vision descending behind a haze, losing herself in that spinning black circle framed by the most brilliant red. Chapter 80, Embers Part 4. Patience has its limits, take it too far and it's cowardice, George Jackson. Naruto had to almost physically stop himself as he found himself running blindly through the trees towards the site of the explosion. It raged on ahead of him, like some great ghost of light reaching up towards the sky as if in some ancient prayer. The shockwave had already traveled past him, bending the trees that had been crushed in the previous tidal wave back the other way. Many couldn't take all the differing pressures and had snapped completely, reduced to kindling by the opposing forces. Now the blonde was having to deal with the intense heat washing over the area, however that was more tolerable, especially when Naruto was completely unconcerned by anything other than Fu's safety, including his own. He came to a stop near a blackened tree stump, taking deep, calming breaths to clear his mind of his distress. Once he had and he could think a lot more clearly, he remembered the various tools in his arsenal to help him with situations like these. Instantly he brought his hand about to summon Fu to him, it would be the fastest way to make sure she was safe. Kuchio, Naruto stopped, gazing oddly at his hand that was trembling just a scant few inches above the surface of the ground. What if Fu wasn't okay and what he was about to summon to him wasn't the girl he loved, but only what was left of her? The young monk's eyes widened at the implications his own mind was giving him, horrific images of burned skin and darkened flesh flashing across his mind. His hand curled inwards shakily as he withdrew it from the ground towards his chest, almost protectively as he stared blankly at the dusty ground. No, he shook his head fiercely, snapping himself out of his own petrification. It was an alien sensation he hadn't felt for a long time, not since Mizu no Kuni. If anything, he was only delaying what help he might be able to give to Fu. She could be badly injured and he was just standing here deliberating over whether he could face her death. However, once again his hand paused above the ground, quivering with restraint as the words just couldn't make it past his lips. He slowly shook his head, his heart pounding in his ears as he straightened up, reaching out with his senses for any sign of his wayward friend. However, the air was just too dry, the heat from the explosion evaporating any water vapor to beyond useful levels. Charred and lightly burning leaves fluttered past his head, glowing pale hues of orange and yellow as they blackened and broke apart. The blonde stared at his own hand, as if confused by his own inaction. Quivering rippled orbs traced his palm as if it would hold the answer of what to do. However, he didn't find the answer there, but in the faint shine of the Magatama necklace hanging around his neck that glowed in the iridescent light of the various fires littering the forest. Gently he touched a finger to one of the beads, remembering when Fu had given him the gift. His eyes steeled at that. Even if Fu was dead, he needed to know as much. Naruto. This time Naruto's hand paused for an entirely different reason as the faint voice found its way through the trees towards him. Naruto turned so fast towards that voice it would have made the Raikage raise an eyebrow, just in time to see Fu stumble out of the nearby tree line, seeming a little confused and lost. Fu, you're okay. She had a few light burns and scalds across the skin he could see, and she seemed more than a little exhausted by her fight, but none of that mattered, she was alive. I'm not sure. Orange eyes widened in surprise, faltering on her words as she was suddenly enveloped in a warm embrace. Naruto had crossed the distance between them faster than she could have believed, wrapping her in a warm, comforting hug that had her unconsciously sighing in relief. It was here when she knew it was over, here in these arms where she felt safe. It doesn't matter, you're okay, that's all that matters. Fu nodded, a faint smile on her face as she simply enjoyed the contact. Naruto was right, it didn't matter how she was okay, or even how she escaped the blast. However, as that thought came to her, she couldn't help but frown. Something nagged at the back of her mind, something inexplicable she couldn't quite grasp. As she opened her eyes, she found herself staring at the kunai she held perfectly balanced between her fingers, having gone unnoticed until now. Why was she holding it like that, pointed right at Naruto's back? Something about that didn't seem right to her, but once again the reason why only drew a blank within her mind. Almost as if in slow motion she watched ponderously as she stabbed the small metal implement right into the blonde's back. The way she had done it would have lodged the blade right into Naruto's heart. A quick turn and he wouldn't even have realized what had happened before his blood pressure had dropped sufficiently and his body went into shock. It would have been a relatively quick death. Fu had seen it a few times before. However, the last few dregs of nature chakra still within Naruto's system saw to it that his danger instincts kicked in just in time to move his body slightly to the left. Instead of piercing his heart, the clean, sharp blade merely nicked it, instead puncturing the lung. Before Fu could twist the kunai to correct the slight error, Naruto staggered back, his eyes opened wide in disbelief and pain with the kunai still firmly lodged in his back. He tried to reach around and pull out the blade on instinct, but it was in an awkward position he couldn't reach. It was probably what saved his life. Fu. He dropped to a knee, teeth clenched in pain as he tried to grab a hold of his erratic chakra system. He had already expunged the remains of the natural energy in his body. After all, if he lost concentration over that, then it would have been far more fatal than a knife to his back. Fu, what's going on, Gu? Naruto grunted as he rolled to the side to avoid a fast leg swipe aimed at his chest that would have severely worsened his condition. You moved, that will make this more complicated. Fu stood back up straight, seemingly ignoring the various injuries across her body as she leveled an even, emotionless look at the blonde. Naruto wanted to cringe away from those eyes, so cold, so lacking in any kind of warmth or compassion. It was like the last 3 years might as well never have happened. However, he stood too, a generous distance between the pair as they stared across at one another. Fu had to commend Naruto. Even with a rather serious chest wound, he was able to stand perfectly straight. It was no doubt thanks to his Asura Path's metal coating stopping the worst of the bleeding. Fu, what is going on? Why are you doing this? The mint-haired girl didn't answer him, merely glancing across his body, picking it apart as she searched for weaknesses to exploit. This was the cold, calculated executioner Naruto had saved from Taki, not the friend and lover he had come to know after all this time. Wings burst from the girl's back, launching her up into the air with rapid but powerful strokes from the insectoid appendages. Fu wasted no movements as she breathed out a cloud of very recognizable, glittering dust that quickly surrounded the area. At the same moment she brought her hands into the tiger seal. Rinpungaku. Shinra Tensai. Fu never got the chance to ignite the dust as it was pushed back like the great invisible hand of a god had merely swept it aside. She stared down at the blonde at the center of it all, with his clothing torn and his upper half exposed, his hair falling across his eyes to shadow them, and standing amongst the smoldering remains of a forest in the wake of Deidara's last bomb. He looked like some entity of destruction. However, when he lifted his head there was no anger in his eyes, only sadness and betrayal that was quickly masked by a cold steel. I asked what was going on, Fu. The amber-eyed girl again chose not to answer as a liquid, bubbling mass of chakra slowly covered her form. This briefly made Naruto's eyes widen. The chakra cloak lacked any of its usual definition or crispness, meaning Fu was forcefully drawing it against Chomei's will. However, those thoughts took a backseat as 4 wings practically burst from the chakra cloak, as well as a long spindly tail that swayed behind the Jinchuriki menacingly. Naruto tried to gain a grip on the situation, but Fu seemed determined on preventing him any kind of thought as she shot forward, her wings a blur and her body merely an orange blob as she skimmed across the ground towards him. Shinra Ten. Naruto brought his arm up, the words coming from his mouth by instinct only for him to trip over his tongue as instead of the vile orange mass of chakra he saw Fu, the real Fu, the girl he had woken up with not a single night ago after just having made love. His moment of indecision cost him as Fu flew right by him, a quiet descending over the burning clearing. Arg. Naruto fell to his knees, clutching at his arms as they leaked a steady stream of blood from the 2 large gashes across his forearms. Even his Asura Path hadn't been strong enough to match Fu's Biju-enhanced water swords. At least he had managed to bring up a quick defense, or those gashes would have had pride of place alongside the ones Kisame had given him across his chest. However, the pain didn't stop him from bringing his hands up into the ram seal in preparation for Fu's second run. Suddenly the girl found herself strafing to the left and right as great tendrils of sand leapt to Naruto's defense, trying to indiscriminately swat Fu from the sky. Instantly the girl could tell this was Shukaku's work, not Naruto's, which could only mean he was Geto. Kusari. Fu was right in realized it just in time to divert her course, screaming up into the air as 5 black chains burst from the ground beneath her, swirling and constricting around thin air. However, they weren't fooled long, and soon she was racing across the sky with the surprisingly dexterous chains in pursuit. However, where she would duck between trees, they would rip right through them in their attempts to halt her. What the girl didn't realize in her haste to get away was that they were simply shepherding her in a loop back towards the clearing. Bansho Tenon. Fu's eyes widened when she realized what was happening, too late as her head spun around to see Naruto's outstretched hands. However, only one aimed at her, the other at a massive ball of sand hovering a distance away in the clearing. The two immediately began flying at one another as their respective gravitation fields towards between each other were amplified greatly. To her credit, Fu didn't even let out a grunt as he body crashed into the sand sphere, quickly being engulfed by the more malleable material until only her head remained outside, still burning with her Biju's forcefully taken energy. Fu, talk to me, tell me what is going on. Again Naruto wanted to look away as Fu's cold, emotionless eyes met with his own as her head slowly turned to him. They were completely orange now, lacking any kind of humanity within as the dark energy's influence showed through. I would have thought it obvious, I'm trying to kill you. Her tone, while level and perfectly cold, was still warped and twisted by the chakra shroud, coming out as a growl. Naruto's eyes hardened as he brought the sand sphere closer, chains wrapping around it carefully as an added layer of restraints. Why? Fu's eyes narrowed as she continued to struggle against her bonds. However, while Naruto's body was weakened by his injuries, his control over the sand, aided by Shukaku, was absolute and it didn't budge an inch. Fu, why are you doing this? What happened? Still not getting an answer, Naruto's frown deepened. He took a step forward, placing his hand on Fu's forehead, wincing as the malevolent chakra burned him. However, the pain was dulled through the Asura path and he ignored it, instead sending a pulse of his chakra through Fu's system, trying to break the genjutsu she had to be under. She had to be, so he sent another pulse. There was no other explanation, she had to be under a genjutsu, so he sent another pulse. However, as Naruto sent powerful and disruptive pulses of his chakra through the girl's system, the shroud of orange chakra refused to recede. She still glared at him with those cold, unfeeling eyes as his attempts to break the increasingly unlikely genjutsu continued to fail. Finally he took a step back, a mix of anger and defeat across his features as nothing changed. He brought his hands up into a ram's seal, stopping his chakra before pulsing out, even stronger. If Fu wasn't under a genjutsu, then he had to be. However, pulse after pulse and he was left with exactly the same scenario. Ah, there it is. Naruto froze as the carefree but pleased tone floated around the clearing, making the blonde look up towards the man carelessly lounging on the branch of a nearby tree, the smoldering bark apparently not concerning him. There's the look I was going for, the defeat, the anguish. He hopped out of the tree, his feet not even bending the grass beneath him as he landed and not making the slightest noise, like he wasn't really there. You know, I had considered coming before you as Toby, but I think it would be insulting to you to talk to you as that idiotic persona. So instead here I am. Naruto's eyes narrowed at the man who shouldn't exist. Literally, Naruto couldn't even feel the slightest thing that could be called a presence from him. Who are you? Naruto found his hand unconsciously bailing into a fist as the man aimlessly wandered towards him. The frustration over this situation, the exhaustion he was feeling from everything that happened, it was all being directed at this Akatsuki robe-wearing man right now. Oh me, I'm nobody. Naruto's ringed eye twitched lightly at that. Something about that statement felt intrinsically wrong to the young blonde. His identity was everything to him. Who he was to his friends, to his loved ones, it was all that mattered, that and who they were to him. For this man to so carelessly throw all that away with such a casual statement, it was like everything Naruto hated in 2 words. Oh yes, there it is again, the anger. I'm not sure if I should feel blasphemous or elated that I can make a monk feel such an emotion. After a moment here it appeared the masked man was actually considering this. His hand against what would have been his chin had the orange, swirled mask not been there, he simply shrugged. Ah well, you were never really that good of a monk anyway. After all, his voice became deeper, far more menacing as Naruto felt his one eye, hidden by the darkness of the mosque's eyehole, bore right into him. Monks don't kill people, nay. It was just for a moment, a fleeting moment, but as the masked man stressed that final word, Naruto was back in Mizu, Shizuku's blood on his hand and Yagura's taunting smile in front of him. "You did this, didn't you?" He made no motion to fu as his voice became icy cold, but the man seemed to get his point either way, glancing over to the bound girl with an indecipherable expression thanks to the mask. How very astute, or maybe I just made it really obvious. In any case, suppose I did, what would it matter then? His voice had a lilting, mocking tone to it as he rocked back and forth, arms behind his back like some cheeky schoolboy who thought he had done the most hilarious thing in front of the teacher. "What did you do to her?" The masked man cocked his head to one side like a dog for a moment before glancing at Fu again. "Couldn't you tell? It's a genjutsu, of course. I had thought you would have worked that much out yourself." His voice spelled it out like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Naruto didn't realize it, but just the sound of this man's carefree voice was causing his fist to tighten until his knuckles turned white. Why? Why are you doing this? It was a valid question, even if it took all of Naruto's reasoning just to ask, as opposed to trying to crush this man against the ground for what he had caused Fu to do. If he had the opportunity to put her under a genjutsu, he could have simply taken her, or killed her. This all just seemed too elaborate. Simple. I wanted this, right here. The masked man gestured around the clearing in a grand sweeping motion that seemed a little too theatrical for the tense situation. I wanted you to despair, to feel this defeat you do now, so you could understand the unfairness of it all, the unfairness of this fake illusion of a world. Naruto had to fight back the snarl as it took every ounce of his self-control to take a shaky, but mildly calming breath. What for? He refused to give the satisfaction of a reaction to this man, or at least he wouldn't have had the man not spoken his next words. For peace, of course. Naruto took a step forward, his violet rippled eyes flashing with anger for a split second. However, when his foot touched the ground again, he was no longer in that smoldering clearing, but in the massive octagonal room of his seal. He blinked in confusion, glancing around at the assembled Biju he had appeared in front of for some kind of an explanation. Some of them seemed worried, like Shukaku and Matabi, others like Seiken and the Gobi seemed more curious than anything, while the Kyuubi had that same dispassionate, mildly irritated expression it always had. What's going on? Why am I here? He looked around, waiting for one of the mighty beings of chakra to speak. Yet whenever one of them looked like they were about to, they sent a furtive glance towards the Kyuubi's cage. Finally, those Shukaku broke the terse silence, having been fidgeting frantically before. Father was very angry. Naruto's confusion only grew until the Kyuubi's great rumbling voice echoed throughout the room. What the Tanuki means is, you were drawing on our chakra. Naruto blinked in genuine surprise at that. He hadn't even felt himself doing it. Then again, the only other time he had really called upon his tenant's chakra, even subconsciously, was against Yagura. The Kyuubi's giant slitted eye followed the blonde carefully before narrowing slightly. Just as you were thinking, you would have likely lost control again had I not pulled you in here. Naruto's frown deepened as he turned towards the fox, a glimmer of hope entering his ripple orbs. Then, you helped me. His trousers, scuffed up and torn as they were, rippled in the warm breeze the Kyuubi's snort of derision caused. Please Ninjin, nothing so mundane. I merely decide who uses my chakra. At that, Naruto's head lowered slightly, his hair falling forward to shadow his eyes. That's it then. In the deafening silence of the seal, the light sound of a single drop of water splashing against cold concrete could be heard like a gong. Naruto looked down at the tear staining the floor before bringing a hand up to catch the one still clinging to his cheek. This is still the way it is, after everything that's happened. His voice was eerily quiet, yet all the Biju could hear it perfectly. Ning. My name is Naruto. The blonde's voice echoed as the sheer anger and emotion carried across the room like a physical shockwave. The Kyuubi's eyes widened slightly as with the shout, the cell door of his cage simply crumpled. There was no give, no strain from the metal, it was simply crunched into a ball like it was nothing more than tin foil in the hands of a disinterested child. The monk himself was now hovering a few feet off the ground, his eyes still shadowed and his hands balled into fists. Why? His voice was no longer a whisper, clearly carrying across the room as if it were being projected by some speaker. Why do you have to make it this way? When his head lifted up, each Biju could see that his eyes were slightly red and there were a few tear stains across his cheeks. Just this once, why can't you help me? When it's Fu, when it's someone I care about, why can't you just stop with this needless hatred and help me? Slowly as he spoke his voice became less saddened and instead, angrier as his frustrations finally got to him. However, after a moment of eye contact between the monk and the great fox, Naruto finally looked away, seeming to deflate as his anger just left him. Why? His dropped to the ground, not having even realized he had somehow traversed the distance between them, so he was standing right before the Kyuubi, inside the creature's cell. Somewhere behind them the remains of the cell door, previously having been floating like some piece of astral debris, dropped to the ground with a resounding clang, apparently breaking everyone out of the silence that had enveloped the room. What is this? Naruto looked up, blinking once with deadened, lifeless eyes up at the beast who was right in front of him, its snout so close that each breath was sending warm gusts over his body. Who is this pathetic ninja standing in front of me, bawling like some worthless child to its parent? A little life returned to Naruto's eyes as his hands baled into fists again, anger flooding his system. My name is Naruto, not Ninja. A growl rippled from the fox's throat as red eyes met purple and the two silently stared each other down, neither one giving way. No, it isn't. I know Naruto Uzumaki, this weak, feeble child is not the bearer of my father's eyes. Naruto nearly shouted back to the risible tones spoken from the deep, resonating voice, but caught himself before he could, realizing just what the Biju had said. What? The fox rose up on its legs, rising to its full, impressive height that Naruto had the distinct impression was a lot smaller when he was younger, however its eyes never left the blonde's. Naruto Uzumaki stared me in the face and didn't flinch, the most powerful of the Biju. He refused the power inside of him, choosing to rely on his own. If the others in the room took offense to that, they certainly didn't speak up, too enraptured by the conversation going on. You, some crying little ninja that has given up, or not him? Naruto stared up at the enormous fox, blinking once, then twice, before wiping away the tears that threatened to continue leaking from his eyes. Maybe you aren't worthy of the eyes given to you if you continue to dishonor my father with this cowardice. The being of chakra leant even closer, so its great snout, the nostril alone large enough to swallow Naruto whole, was nearly touching the boy. I would be more than happy to rip them from your skull. A vicious, menacing grin split the creature's snout as the two silently stared again. Then what should I do? Naruto felt as though he had at least calmed down somewhat, his voice reflected that as it became level and in control again. The Kyuubi just snorted, bringing one of its great paws around until one of its gleaming white claws hung steadily in front of Naruto's chest. With a single twitch of its finger it could have impaled the blonde as easily as it might crush some stray fly. Instead it lightly tapped him on the chest, pushing the monk back a step from the small, but to a human great, force. Why ask me? Are you not the one always screaming about making one's own path in this world or some other such nonsense? The voice was a growl, but for the Kyuubi the tone was light, almost indifferent, as if it had simply lost interest in the conversation. Naruto paused, staying quiet for a moment before finally looking away from the Kyuubi to his own balled-up fist. He regarded it for a moment before finally allowing it to relax. It was like a wave of relief passing through his body, washing away his frustration and allowing him to think clearly. He turned, walking out of the Kyuubi's cell and back towards the center of the room, pausing in the middle. Thank you, Kyuubi. He looked up at the ceiling of the room where the various pipes representing his chakra branched off into the cages, what was keeping the seal in check. Mixed in among them were the pipes of the Biju's chakra, and the largest amongst them, the Kyuubi's. He supposed that pipe had always been there, for as long as he had been in this world, it was just as much a part of him as the others. Naruto. The blonde froze, turning slowly to face the Kyuubi again, the great fox having once again descended to lie on its paws, a look of disinterest once again on its face as it trained only a single lazy eye on the monk. It was the first time the Biju had ever actually called Naruto by his name, ever. You can stop referring to me by that ridiculous ninja title, my name is Kurama. Slowly, a soft, warm smile spread across Naruto's face as the full implication of that little, seemingly insignificant admission hit him. He gave a firm nod as his body began to fade from view. Only his voice staying on, carried as if by some unseen wind. Thank you then, Kurama. Finally the Biju were left alone, waiting for their cells to once again split apart as always happened when Naruto left. However, before that happened, Kurama noticed his fellow Biju all looking at him with varying expressions, but most noticeably shock. He let out a low, menacing growl as he stared them all down with one fearsome red eye. What? Naruto didn't even have to open his eyes to know his was back in reality. With his mind clear once more, he could feel everything again. The smell of smoldering leaves, the faint sounds of cicada chirps, everything. He slowly opened his eyes, pulling back his foot and standing up straighter, letting out a deep, calming breath to lower his heart rate for real before finally looking back at the masked man. Remarkable, you didn't even take a second to rein in your emotions. Maybe you're a better monk than I give you credit for. It was funny, after facing the Kyuubi, Kurama, this strange, aggravating man didn't seem to even faze him anymore. Undo whatever it is you did to Fu. The man cocked his head to the side again, this time in the opposite direction than before, and if he wasn't wearing the mask, Naruto was sure he would have raised an eyebrow. Oh, but then wouldn't that defeat the purpose of doing it at all? I don't think you seem to get it after all. What a shame. Naruto let out a slight chuckle at that, a chilling noise when the blonde had his hair shadowing his face to the point where only his Rinnegan eyes, lightly glowing in the dim light of the evening, could be seen. No, you don't understand, I wasn't asking. You will return Fu to how she was. In a split second the earth behind Toby, or whatever he didn't like to call himself, erupted into a mass of sandy spikes, each tipped with the ends of one of Naruto's chains. However, as each spike skewered the man's body, he didn't even flinch, nor did he seem to be affected in the slightest. In fact, there wasn't even any blood, or sign the spikes had made contact at all, despite them having obviously gone right through him. Interesting, even with me standing still like this you aimed for non-vital spots like my limbs. The masked man glanced about at the weapons that were supposed to have immobilized him as if he were simply observing some odd curio. Naruto's eyes narrowed marginally at the revealed ability, tens of possibilities running through his head in a split instant before a light smile formed over his features, something to which the man took immediate notice of. After all, the blonde wasn't supposed to be smiling. He was supposed to be in anguish. It made him wonder just what had happened in that split second. That's an incredible ability you have there, to completely phase through an object as if your body was completely immaterial. Naruto nodded slowly as if he were thinking through the various possibilities such an ability would allow. It was like the ultimate passive-aggressive tool. Somewhere in the background the explosion had died out, allowing the surrounding area to cool, but more importantly, allowing water vapor back closer to the ground. Naruto could feel it. Around the spikes the man's body was definitely there, but wherever he was physically hit he could phase that part away. Selective immaterialism, definitely useful. It would also explain how you were able to stand on solid ground without just sinking right through it. Again Naruto nodded, slower this time. However, at this point he could almost feel the marginal frown that had passed over the man's features from behind the mask. By now Naruto had retracted the sand spikes, they would do him no good here anyway. However, he raised a hand, splayed out with his palm, facing the ground as he pointed it at the masked Akatsuki. What would happen if I made things a bit heavier? Slowly he began to close his hand, and instantly the man felt his own body began to get heavier as the gravity around him was slowly but definitely increased. Let's see, if you stay material you'll slowly be crushed into the floor, your body collapsing under its own weight. A slightly cruel spark alighted in Naruto's rippled eyes. This was the man who had nearly taken Fu away from him, who had caused him to fight the girl he loved. However, if you chose to use your technique, you will have to use it across your entire body. I'm not sure which sounds worse, being crushed, or sinking through the Earth's surface, a slave to its gravity until you are crushed by the pressure down there or incinerated by the heat. Slowly the man began to sink to his knees, his mask and the one dark eyehole still trained on the blonde. You wouldn't, you're a monk. Naruto's eyes merely narrowed, his hand closing a little quicker in response to the taunt. That's a very flexible term. He was about to close his hand, but before he could, the Akatsuki member growled, his body beginning to distort in a strange way as it swirled out of existence, centered around the visible but darkened eye. Well played, Uzumaki, well played. Finally the man disappeared, but not before allowing Naruto to catch a glimpse of just what lay behind that darkened eye hole. The blonde's eyes widened in surprise at the sight of a fully developed Sharingan eye, barely even paying attention as the man finally vanished completely as he turned back to Fu. The girl was still cloaked in her Biju's chakra, but it seemed to be visibly straining her to maintain. At this point Naruto felt he had to act quickly before she could be allowed to hurt herself. He had an idea of just what the man had done now from that little glimpse at his dujutsu, memories of Yagura and the Sanbi's condition when it was first absorbed appearing in his mind. However, at the same time he couldn't quite be sure. In any case he had to try, consequences be damned. With that in mind he laid his hand against Fu's forehead, making sure his sand was spread evenly across her body as he began to slowly but surely siphon away her chakra. I'm sorry. I hope you can forgive me for this afterwards, Fu, Chome. Naruto slowly walked through the forest path, Fu in his arms carried bridal style as they traveled through the still night air. Naruto had unsealed one of his spare houris to cover his exposed chest and had managed to bandage the worst of his and Fu's injuries, but had decided not to sleep near the fortress despite his mounting exhaustion. It was too exposed, and those two shinobi from earlier that were fighting there unnerved him. He wanted to be gone from there. However, as he was walking he noticed his eyelids beginning to droop, his limbs felt heavy and Fu felt even heavier, and it was beginning to become a chore to keep going. Gently, he set Fu down next to an old, weathered tree trunk and nestled in next to her, smiling as he finally got a bit of rest. He wrapped an arm around Fu and brought the girl in closer to him, sharing their warmth as he allowed his eyes to finally close. Just a bit of rest wouldn't hurt them, he'd get up in an hour and carry on going. At last that was what he told himself as he drifted off into a long, well-deserved rest. He never noticed the single cloak-enshrouded figure watching them from up in the trees, the darkened eyeholes of their stylized porcelain mask carefully observing them until they were sure he was asleep. They waited another few minutes before darting off, knowing this was something they had to report to their superiors. Chapter 81, Embers Part 5, Who's Crazy, People Who Trust Other People, or the People Who Don't, Lenore Skenazy. Naruto had a light smile on his face as he slowly opened his eyes. The warm glow of the morning sun was pleasant to wake up to, and the soft cushions below him were satisfyingly comfortable. He shifted into a sitting position, stretching his neck until he got the small cracks he was aiming for, sighing in relief. However, after a moment or two the smile slowly slipped from his face, replaced by a frown as he patted the soft, yielding surface beneath him. It most certainly wasn't the much harder earthen bed he had slept on last night. His eyes shot open, any early morning fuzziness vanishing as narrowed, rippled eyes took stock of his situation. He was inside, sitting on a rather plain, but cozy couch in a large office-like room he didn't recognize. He stood up immediately only to note that there was none of the pain he had been expecting from his injuries. In fact, when he looked down he noticed the 4 large gashes across his torso and the cuts up his forearms were completely gone. They weren't just healed, even his impressive healing factor he gained from the Q from Kurama wouldn't have done this. This caused his frown to resurface as he tried to rationalize why somebody would capture him only to leave him unguarded and with his own clothes while healing him of non-life-threatening injuries. The answer quickly became obvious when he tried to reach out through the water vapor in the room to try and gain a better understanding of his surroundings, only to draw a blank. He couldn't access his chakra at all. It wasn't like back on Uzushio where he could feel it brimming just under the surface, waiting to be released. He simply couldn't access even a single drop of his own chakra. His eyes narrowed again, mildly congratulating his captors. There was no need for a jail cell after all if the prisoner couldn't use any of his abilities. He got up, already having noticed the lack of the green-haired girl he had gone to sleep with the previous night and adding it to his growing list of concerns. He let none of it show on his face though, as for all he knew he was being watched and he would definitely not give his captors the satisfaction of seeing him worry. Instead he made his way over to the large panoramic window on the far side of the office, behind the desk stacked almost to the brim with various paperwork. Naruto wasn't sure whether to be shocked or irritated when he looked out and saw the sprawling village of Konohagakure laid out before him. It's changed quite a bit since you were last here, hasn't it? Naruto's breath silently hitched as that warm, familiar voice floated through the room from behind him. He hadn't even heard the door being opened. Naruto didn't turn, not sure if he actually could, as his eyes traced various new buildings he didn't recognize and others that were still under construction. It's still the same village, no matter how you change its appearance. The soft chuckle he received once again surprised him as it came from almost right beside him. Once again he had not been able to hear the man walk across the room. It seemed without his chakra his senses had been completely dulled. The outcome was actually rather unnerving, it was like everything had become dimmer. Oh no, I like to think that the village is always changing, evolving, trying to become something new as the younger generations rise up to surpass their predecessors. This time it was Naruto's turn to gain a light smile as the familial words sent a wave of nostalgia over his being. You told me something similar when I was younger, although at the time I suppose I barely listened. The older man chuckled again and Naruto heard the faint sounds of him sucking on his pipe, only increasingly the nostalgia he felt. No, you never did seem to pay attention unless it was about the Hokage or the various stories I told you about the famous shinobi from the past. Although now I suspect you are the one with the stories to tell, am I right? Naruto finally turned, having to bite back the catch in his throat as he looked up at the face of the one man left he could call family in this village since the Ichiraku were taken from him. It's good to see you again, old man. Hiruzen looked down at the young monk, his aged features stretched into a warm, happy smile that seemed to lift years off his features. And you, my boy. The two stood there a moment, both just taking in how the other had changed in the time since they had last seen each other. Their last meeting, during the invasion of Konoha 3 years again, had been rushed and left little time for words or greetings, so they took this opportunity to simply be in each other's presence again. Why am I here? The silence had to end eventually and Naruto decided he should be the one to get things going again. The longer he looked at his old grandfather figure the more memories were dredged up, both painful and happy. Hiruzen sighed lightly, taking a long drag from his pipe before tapping it out into a bin next to the desk. One of the Anbu spotted you out in the forests on his patrol. They have standing orders to report any sightings of you and if possible, to bring you to the village without using force. Naruto raised an eyebrow at that, so capturing him while he was asleep wasn't considered the use of force. It sure as heck wasn't the use of persuasion. However, he pushed that aside as he got to the question that was really on his mind. What about Fu? Hiruzen was turned away from him so he missed the slight smile that passed over the elderly Kage's face. It truly made him happy to hear the concern in Naruto's voice for his friend. It was good to see he cared strongly for his precious people still. The girl who was with you. She's in the hospital right now, being treated for a severe case of chakra exhaustion. She is also under Anbu guard, for her own protection. Naruto said nothing to this, absorbing it all in. He said nothing because he wasn't quite sure what to say. It all hit him in this moment. The man standing before him wasn't just his Gigi, the man he had come to see as a grandfather as a child. He was also the Sandaime Hokage and had to act as such. The blonde's rippled eyes narrowed slightly, something that didn't go unnoticed by the elderly Hokage. Also, Hiruzen sighed, the smile on his wrinkled features lessening slightly as he looked out over Konoha's picturesque vista that the office window afforded him. Naruto, when you come to be my age you realize that you can never handle the things you find precious carefully enough. Naruto's eyes only narrowed at that. He hadn't wanted to believe it at first but it was true. He was simply standing in one giant, gilded cage. Then my chakra. Hiruzen turned back to him, pipe in his mouth as he carefully observed the boy. Naruto took notice of the fact his eyes briefly drifted down to his stomach. I understand you have grown very powerful, or at least the reports I get of your various exploits seem to point to that. The old Kage looked up, a hand on his chin as he lightly stroked his small gray goatee. The forces I had stationed across the elemental nations got the occasional sightings of a young blonde monk appearing around the times of instability within their respective nations. He chuckled, tapping his pipe thoughtfully against his cheek as Naruto remained silent. Sunagaku losing its Jinchuriki, no matter how hard they tried to cover it up. The same goes for Takigaku, and there was some kind of trouble in Kumo that was quickly covered up amongst others. Naruto was quietly glad the older man hadn't brought up Mizu no Kuni. I assume it is some kind of seal. Hiruzen looked around, his thick eyebrow quirked up slightly as the very business-like tone the blonde had donned. The Naruto he knew could never have been that mature, so much like his father and he didn't even know it. Naruto, as powerful as you are, as powerful as anyone can be, one person cannot be afforded the same security as an entire village. Naruto nodded slowly although his eyes barely disguised their disagreement. At the same time Naruto noticed that the Hokage would occasionally glance at his Rinnegan only to immediately look elsewhere. So you think you are doing this for my protection? It wasn't a question and the Hokage knew that, however he chose to take a moment as if in thought all the same. I am doing this for your protection Naruto, as I always have done. The blonde said nothing, remaining frustratingly calm and subdued. While Hiruzen would not wish for a negative reaction from his surrogate grandson, he still wanted some kind of emotion. What he was getting instead was a cold, almost harsh attitude, made worse by the dispassionate look in his swirled violet eyes. It was an expression of mistrust, which was heart-wrenching for the old man. As this village's Jinchuriki, Hiruzen wanted desperately to deny that such a thing had anything to do with the matter, however to do so would bring up issues he wasn't ready to talk about. After all, for what other reason would the Hokage possibly take such personal interest in an otherwise unremarkable, if not very individual, orphan? At least that was how he knew it must appear to the boy, even if it was not true. If Naruto was a Jinchuriki first in the Kage's eyes, it was basically admitting the kind old man was putting up a persona to get on his good side, and if Naruto wasn't a Jinchuriki first, why make him a big deal in the first place? The moment of silence was all the answer Naruto needed though as he turned and began walking towards the door of the office, noticing for the first time that his shikuju had been carefully leant up against the wall. I trust that as long as I don't try to escape I will be left alone. He didn't need to see Hiruzen to know the old man had nodded slowly so he simply picked up his staff and walked out. Briefly he enjoyed the amusing thought of how many shinobi must have collapsed from chakra loss to bring it even this far. Oddly though, even with his chakra suppressed, he felt no draw from the staff, no attempt to siphon his chakra. It was curious, but he paid it no mind for the moment, opting to simply walk from the room in silence. Hiruzen stared at the closed door for a good few moments, lost in his own thoughts until a voice finally knocked him out of his own little world. Brr, I feel like the temperature of the room just dropped a few degrees sensei. The old Hokage sighed, out of frustration or simple exasperation was up for debate. I assume you were listening in the entire time Jiraiya. The aforementioned Toad Sage hopped into the room from the window, a carefree grin on his face as he rolled to an unnecessarily flamboyant entrance. Of course sensei, you know me better than that. Hiruzen gave him a non-committal shrug in that way that always seemed to irritate the old sage. And Jiraiya gave a lopsided grin as he casually flopped into the Hokage's chair, playfully spinning around on it a few times. Well, you can't exactly expect me to come to a conclusion from just that, can you? Hiruzen simply leveled an even glare at the younger man, causing his grin to lessen slightly and become sheepish as he rubbed the back of his head. Well, he's certainly inherited Kushina-chan's chakra reserves if he can carry that staff around with him. It nearly exhausted me just getting it to the village. Hiruzen sighed melancholically at that, leaning against the desk wearily. And the seal? Did you get a chance to examine it? At that Jiraiya's face became serious, as it always did on the matter of Fuinjutsu. It was a point of pride for the old Hokage. Well, on that account I'm stumped. Hiruzen raised an eyebrow at that in worry as he looked around at his student. He was a master of Fuinjutsu and if something was above him then it was definitely a point for concern. Was something wrong with it? Jiraiya shook his head slowly, bearing a perplexed expression as he stared down at the desk, his mind obviously elsewhere. Nothing, but that's just the thing, it was nearly perfect. Hiruzen's eyebrow raised again, but this time from confusion. Then what's the problem? Jiraiya blinked, coming back from his head as he looked up at the aged Kage. Well, by all accounts the seal should have weakened a lot more by now, at least that's the impression I get from Minato's notes. However, it's perfect, like it had just been applied a few months ago. So either Minato underestimated his own work, which I doubt, or I'm missing something. Hiruzen waved his hand absently at his student, his own expression becoming distant as he thought on the new information. Think on it and I'm sure it will come. In the meantime try talking to Naruto when you have the chance, you may have better luck than me. At that Jiraiya nodded before a sly smile found its way onto his features. Of course, but you know it might be a good idea to give the kid some distance right now. He was basically kidnapped after all and he knows it. Hiruzen sighed, wishing his student wouldn't put it like that. So I think I'll go do some, research while he cools down. A perverted grin came to the man's face as he left the room via the same way he came in, how he always came into the Hokage's office. Once again Hiruzen was left to his own thoughts as he looked out over the panoramic view of his home and the Hokage monument. Particularly he stared up at the face of the man who was supposed to be his successor, drawing strength from it as he so often found himself doing. Minato, I hope I am doing the right thing here. Despite the long time, almost 10 years in fact, since Naruto had properly been in the village, he found he could make his way around easily enough. The paths through the village, both those that would take him in and out of the public eye, were as familiar to him then as they had been as a child. It was simple then for him to take a winding path through various back alleys that kept him away from the village proper. The familiar feel of his shikuju's wooden texture against his hand was comforting in the absence of his chakra as he finally walked out onto a more populated street. He got a few curious looks from passers-by, no doubt because of his slightly unorthodox clothing and the unique headband he wore, but nothing more. For the most part people seemed content to simply ignore him and go about their own business. It was actually slightly unnerving if Naruto was honest with himself. He tried to put that behind him though as he walked through the open glass doors of the hospital, his nose twitching at the various smells of disinfectants and the sterile atmosphere that made him inwardly cringe. He had hated hospitals as a child, too much sitting still in harsh whites that were painful to look at. Well, I figured it was only a matter of time until you decided to show up here. I actually figured it would be sooner. Naruto froze as for the second time that day a familiar voice cropped up behind him, once again taking him by surprise thanks to his limited senses. What, got nothing to say to your sensei brat? A large, genuine smile worked its way over Naruto's lips as he turned to see Tsunade grinning at him from across the reception of the hospital. It was a very heart-warming scene, one he remembered all too well, that was, until he walked over and found something incredible. Oh damn, well if the Gaki didn't get taller. It was true, Tsunade actually had to look up a bit to meet the rippled eyes she was accustomed to. You better believe it's Tsunade-sensei. I guess if you're here I have you to thank for this. He gestured to his scar-less chest and forearms with that same smile. It really was good to see Tsunade again, he just needed a familiar face right now. Actually that was Shizune's handiwork. She's really come a long way since we parted ways. Naruto grinned at the thought of seeing Shizune again. Fu would also be happy to see the older girl. They had gained what some might call a pseudo-sibling relationship in their time together. I could say the same for you, what happened to never going back to Konoha? Naruto could remember the many drunken talks the older blonde had shared with him over that particular subject. However Tsunade simply donned a mock-irritated expression as she pulled Naruto into a one-armed hug around his neck that was just a little too tight. Yeah well, some little persistent brat just had to come along and change more than a few of my views now didn't he? So you know what, when sensei offered for me to return, rather insistently I might add, a small vein popped on the woman's forehead as she remembered something obviously irritating, I just didn't have it in me to refuse. She waited for a response only to look down and see that Naruto's face had turned a rather virulent shade of blue. She quickly released him, looking at the younger blonde incredulously as he gasped for air. What's up with you Gaki? That much time away from me make you so weak? Naruto rubbed his throat and gave the woman a dry smile with a small shrug. It seems you lose a lot of things, resistance being one of them, when your chakra is forcefully taken away. A look of realization glinted in Tsunade's eyes as she, like Hiruzen, glanced towards Naruto's chest. Ah, so sensei really did put that seal on you. I told him it would be a bad idea but, Naruto just nodded, cutting her off mid-sentence, having recovered from her over-enthusiastic greeting. But he's the Hokage. Tsunade shrugged helplessly before smiling warmly again, eliciting the same response from the young monk. In any case, it seems you and Fu are sticking around for a while, better get comfy. Naruto grimaced at that. There were things he needed to do, primarily stopping a fellow Rinnegan user with plans revolving around collecting the Biju, something that could not end well considering their historical penchant for destruction. Being forcefully restrained in a shinobi village that would act more as a target than a deterrent to a man like that wasn't exactly helping that plan. However he chose to remain quiet, not wanting to worry the closest thing he had to a mother. So there's nothing you can do. Tsunade let out a quick guffaw, slapping Naruto on the back just a little too hard for his temporarily civilian body to be appreciative of. Sorry Naruto, you're talking to the wrong Sanin. The younger blonde just huffed quietly, rubbing his now aching back with a cringe. He really missed his chakra-reinforced strength right now. It's ironic really, if I took up Sensei's offer to be Hokage I probably could have done something for you. The two began walking through the hospital, taking the stairs to the higher floors where the shinobi were treated. Naruto raised an eyebrow at that, straightening up and looking across at the older woman with interest. You were offered the Hokage position. Tsunade nodded with a mildly over-exaggerated grimace, sticking out her tongue for good measure in that childish way Naruto had come to expect from the supposed old woman. Yeah, like I'd take that sucker's job. If Jiraiya can skirt out of it then there's no way I'm taking it on. Kind of a shame though, there aren't that many people you could call qualified in the next few generations. Kakashi maybe, but that lazy scarecrow would never take it up, he's too stuck in the past. That Uchiha kid might have cut it if he hadn't gone all psycho and murdered his clan. Naruto had to frown mildly at Tsunade's rather crass way of summing it up, but he understood she was simply a blunt person, sugarcoating wasn't her thing. She had seen the harsh realities of the world and had lived long enough to realize there was no point in covering them up for others' benefit. So what is he planning on doing? Tsunade grinned conspiratorially at him in a way that distinctly reminded him of the time she had asked him to help play a prank of Shizune because the woman was, quote, far too introverted for her own good and could use some shaking up. Ah, the old man's probably cooking up some way to convince me or Jiraiya to take it, but unless the old perv gets that much-deserved castration that's been coming to him or Konoha starts to become the sake capital of the elemental nations, I'd like to see him try. Naruto had to share a laugh at that. Tsunade had told him a lot of stories from the times when the Sannin were a name to be feared, especially of the Toad Sage's antics. However, more often than not it was Tsunade's reactions or corrections to his behavior she liked to focus on, much to Naruto's chagrin as a man. The two paused as they finally reached a room flanked by two Anbu operatives, however one look from Suond had them both scattering for the shadows. Naruto had to smirk lightly. It would seem that in the hospital Tsunade might as well have been Hokage from the way she was treated. He hadn't missed the various looks and nods of respect the woman had received on their way up from both the shinobi and the staff. It was no wonder too if what he remembered from his own medical training had been applied to the hospital as a whole. Alright, I'll let you in for now, but don't expect too much. I don't know what you put that girl through, but she had quite possibly the worst case of chakra exhaustion I've ever seen. I had to put her in an induced sleep just to get her chakra flowing normally again. Knowing her though, she'll probably be up sometime tomorrow morning. Naruto nodded thankfully as he walked into the small single bed room, no doubt to make guarding Fu easier. Tsunade turned to leave him alone with Fu before thinking better of it, turning on a heel and lightly grabbing Naruto's arm. Don't you stay in this dreary hospital room all day. I know you may not exactly be feeling the most hospitable towards Konoha right now, but you're here, at least make something of it. Go out, just walk around the village for a while. The older woman smiled knowingly, but not in a condescending manner. Naruto knew she was just trying to be helpful in her own way. Actually, this kind of openly affectionate display would never have happened when they first met, and Naruto felt happy that she could open up to him of all people. You never know what could come from it. With that, the woman finally decided to leave, her twin ponytail swaying behind her as she strutted off, a sense of authority practically flowing from her. Naruto smiled softly as he turned back around, sitting himself down in the single chair set up next to the bed, as if specifically for him. Fu looked peaceful just sleeping there, her chest slowly rising and falling. He gently took her hand and made himself comfortable, tightly locking his fingers with hers as a short, humorless laugh escaped his lips. Well, what have I gotten us into this time, Fu? Naruto wasn't sure where he was going as he aimlessly wandered through the thronging streets of Konoha late in the afternoon. He had stayed in the hospital for a few hours but had grown a little restless just sitting there in a sterile, too-white room, even if he wanted to keep Fu company. He was beginning to regret it now as he moved through crowds of people with no other purpose than to just keep walking. He didn't appreciate the many odd looks he got from people due to his unique appearance, nor the hushed whispers people directed away from him. Call him paranoid, but he didn't like the idea of somebody recognizing him. After all, 10 years wasn't too long and blonde wasn't the most common hair color in this part of the elemental nations. When he finally couldn't stand it anymore, he began moving to the quieter areas of the village, simply walking down streets that had progressively less people walking about. Eventually, and curiously, he found himself in what appeared to be a completely abandoned area of the village. He didn't recognize it very well, meaning it was an area he was unaccustomed to as a kid, however he never remembered there being such a desolate area in the entirety of the village. At the same time though he couldn't complain about the peace it offered with the tranquil silence and pleasing, homely aesthetic. Finally he settled down by a large pond that had a small wooden jetty reaching out some way into the waters, sitting down in a meditative position at the end. Slowly he began to draw in deep, long breaths in preparation to do something both unlikely to work, and reckless. He had a theory he needed to test out about the seal that was binding his chakra. It may have been suppressing his own chakra, but if he could simply reach out and tap into the energy surrounding him. A smile broke out on the blonde's face as he tapped into the natural chakra permeating the area. He couldn't directly draw it into himself, but as long as he stilled his being and made himself a conduit. His smile only grew as he felt the bonds around his own chakra begin to weaken, if only slightly, as the natural energy naturally tried to flood his body. It failed due to the chakra suppression seal, but like anything, its attempts eroded away at the bonds holding him hostage within himself. A familiar and welcome warmth began creeping into his body. It was weak, but it was still there. However, after a moment or two it just stopped, leaving him with only a tiny trickle of his chakra. He cut off the connection with the natural energy before it could enter his system through the small gap he made in the seal. After all, one needed large reserves to properly balance themselves with senjutsu, and right now his were pitiful at best. It's about time, Naruto. The deep rumbling voice of the Kyuubi filled his head almost as soon as his chakra began to flow again, startling him and forcing him to open his eyes. However, he was no longer on the jetty in the middle of Konoha, but in his seal, staring up at the irritated and very unbarred expression of the fox himself. Pathetic, being so easily caught by shinobi, not to mention how long it took you to break that little seal. Naruto raised an eyebrow as he stood from his meditative position, dusting his clothes from invisible dirt out of habit. I didn't realize you were waiting for me, I might have come sooner. The fox growled at him lightly, however for once Naruto didn't feel any of the normal hostility. It was like when Tsunade would threaten him, it was just empty. I had just gained some measure of freedom, it's disagreeable to have it taken away so quickly. Naruto continued to look up at the Biju quizzically, forcing it to growl again as it absently gestured to the lack of bars crossing his cell's entrance. Have you already forgotten what you did in your fit of emotion yesterday, or was it so unconcerning? Naruto's eyes widened as he looked over the crushed remains of the Kage's bars, crumpled into a small ball. I did that. The Kyuubi huffed, sending Naruto's robes billowing out behind him, but deigned not to answer. But then, the seal. Have I broken it? The Kyuubi issued a low, rumbling growl as its one open eyes rolled in irritation. Please, there are more pressing concerns right now. With another lazy sweep of his long tail, Kurama brought Naruto's attention around to the new cell adjoining his own. The blonde nearly slapped himself on the spot for forgetting something so absolutely critical. Chome. The blonde dashed around to face the cell in the newly nonagonal room, only to come across a most familiar sight as the great insect stared back at him. While the Nanabi didn't so much have eyes, it had a grill-like faceplate up on what could be called its head with vertical strips that normally glowed a pleasant yellow. However, right now they were burning a deep, oppressive red. Naruto remembered how this had been with the Sanbi and immediately grabbed the bars of the cell, attempting to forcibly push his chakra into the cell to break the genjutsu over the Biju. It seemed he was right in his assumption that Tobi, or whatever his name was, placed Chome under a genjutsu, which was why he couldn't break Fu out of it directly. No, not now. Naruto once again forced his chakra forward, commanding it to flow through his hands and into the cell. However, with the restricting seal only a pathetic trickle came out, to no effect. Must I really do everything? A great sigh resounded through the seal as Naruto saw one of the fox's long furry tails appear over his head before tapping the metal bars of the cell. All at once the ominous red glow disappeared from the Nanabi's face plate before it took a few confused glances around the room. Fu-chan. Moments later the beating of its great six wings slowed to a crawl and it collapsed to the floor of the cage in a similar manner to Isobu those 3 years ago. Naruto glanced across at Kurama, noting his distinct lack of effort despite the fact that Naruto had tried to do the same for the Sanbi and nearly collapsed from exhaustion, and it was just the three tails. Admittedly he had gained a lot more chakra since then, but still, it was awe-inspiring to imagine just how much chakra the fox had. Is Chome going to be alright? The Kyuubi turned to look at him, observing him carefully for a few moments before nodding slowly. The bug will recover shortly. Chome was not under that accursed eye's influence for nearly as long as the turtle and it is more resilient. In any case that doesn't matter, we need to talk Naruto. For a moment Naruto felt a whole lot smaller as the Kyuubi stared him down, an incredibly serious look in his eye.